Sera, a Dungeon Revival LitRPG. By Mizar Kaf. Chapter 41 Experimentation. The air in the Black Eagle's alchemical workshop was heavy with the earthy aroma of dried leaves, pungent spices, and the faint tang of various chemical reactions. Several shelves were lined with jars of vibrant powders, dried roots, and meticulously labeled vials. Every corner of the workshop was filled with workers immersed in their tasks. A young apprentice carefully measured a crystalline powder into a beaker while another worker adjusted the flame beneath a simmering potion, the liquid inside bubbling and roiling. When Sera stepped further inside, several workers glanced up from their workstations. She nodded in acknowledgement, making sure to offer a polite smile. "Have to keep up appearances. Thank you for your hard work, everyone. I'm here to see Desmunda, could someone take me to her?" A young woman with ink-stained fingers stepped forward. "Of course, boss, please follow me." Sera followed her guide past rows of tables and shelves. Soon, they arrived at a sturdy wooden door at the back of the workshop. The young woman knocked gently before pushing it open to reveal a smaller space. The room was dimly lit thanks to light from a single alchemical lamp. Desmunda was standing hunched over a bubbling cauldron. The potion inside gave out a faint greenish light while she added ingredients with expert care. Sera stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click. "Am I interrupting something important?" Desmunda glanced up, her eyes reflecting the glow of the potion. She offered a curt nod before returning her attention to the cauldron. "Hey boss, do you need anything?" Sera moved closer, looking through the array of ingredients and notes scattered around. "Yes, I need some details on our best-selling potions." The alchemist didn't look up from her work as she answered. "Mainly health and stamina potions, infused with viper shade or ether wisp extract. They're expensive, but they're our biggest sellers because they give people the best highs." Sera's gaze lingered on the bubbling cauldron for a moment longer. "Can you provide samples of these best-selling potions? I'd like to taste them." Desmunda nodded as she retrieved 2 small vials from a nearby shelf. She handed them to Sera, her stained fingers brushing against the cool glass. Sera held the first vial up to the light, which contained a dark green liquid. She uncorked it, then took a small sip, the potion sliding down her throat with a cool, almost icy sensation. The taste was a blend of bitter and sweet, with a hint of metallic aftertaste. "I can see why humans will like this, though my body will probably prevent me from feeling its full effects." Next, she turned her attention to the second vial, which contained a potion infused with ether wisp extract. The liquid was a cyan color, almost glowing. She uncorked it, inhaling the earthy, slightly sweet scent. She took a careful sip, the potion warm and smooth, with a taste reminiscent of fresh herbs and a hint of spice. A gentle warmth spread through her, a subtle contrast to the previous potion's icy touch. "This one has more of a kick to it, but I think improvements can be made." Sera set the vials down, her mind cataloguing the properties and potential applications of each potion. She then looked towards Desmunda. "Do you think people would be interested in potions that are more potent?" "Sounds like a no-brainer to me. Some people already go above and beyond to get their fix of the potions we already have available, even I heard that there was a man who sold his children to get his fix." Sera tapped a finger against her sides for a moment. "If I can get even a small portion of the people in Marwood dependent on these potions, it should become very easy to get them to head to the dungeon afterward." "Desmunda, do you happen to know if there's a patch of dirt available nearby?" The alchemist's brow furrowed slightly as she pointed towards another door. "There's a room where I grow mushrooms. It's got some soil." "Perfect. I want to experiment with creating new potions, and you're going to help me with that." Sure. Do you have materials I can work with?" "Follow me," Sera said, turning towards the door. Desmunda sighed deeply and wiped her hands on her stained apron. The weariness etched into her features was undeniable, but a spark of curiosity flickered in her eyes as she reluctantly followed Sera. They stepped into the mushroom-growing room, where the air was noticeably cooler, carrying a rich earthy scent. The room was lit by a few lanterns stretched across the rows of shelves lining the walls. Each one was crammed with trays of mushrooms, ranging from tiny buds to fully mature fungi. Sera moved towards a patch of soil nestled in a corner of the room. She crouched down, gently sifting through the dark, rich earth. She plucked a few mushrooms, their stems snapping crisply in the quiet room. "I'll need to use this patch," Sera said, looking up from her work. Desmunda shrugged half-heartedly. Her fatigue was evident in every aspect of her posture, from the droop of her shoulders to the way she leaned slightly against a nearby shelf. "You're the boss." Sera rose from her crouched position and dusted her hands off. "Tell me, what properties do you think a plant should have to make the most addictive and enjoyable potion for the masses?" Desmonda's eyes narrowed as she considered the question. "Well, for something truly addictive and enjoyable, you'd want a plant with a potent euphoric effect. It should have rapid absorption properties to make the effects immediate. A mild hallucinogenic component could enhance the experience. And, of course, it should have a pleasant taste and aroma to mask any bitterness." Sera nodded, absorbing the alchemist's words. "I'll give you exactly what you need." Boss, what do you mean by that?" "Relax, just watch me." She stepped closer to the patch of soil. After taking a deep breath, Sera tilted her head back slightly and opened her mouth. A moment later, a small, glistening seed appeared on her tongue. She carefully spat the seed into the soil and took a step back. Desmonda watched in fascination as the seed glowed. The soil rippled as if in response to the seed's energy. In a few seconds, a slender green shoot broke through the surface, growing at an astonishing rate. Soon, a plant that was unlike anything Desmonda had ever seen emerged. Its leaves were a deep, iridescent blue with silver veins that pulsed gently as if carrying liquid moonlight. Tiny, luminescent flowers sprouted along the stem, each one carrying petals that shifted colors from deep purple to pale lavender. The air around the plant filled with a sweet, intoxicating fragrance, a blend of night-blooming jasmine and fresh rain. Desmonda stepped closer, eyes wide with amazement. I've never seen a plant like this before. What is it called?" Sera tapped a finger on her chin. "I think I'll call this plant Seluna, which sounds appropriate." Desmonda couldn't tear her eyes away from the mesmerizing plant. "Is it okay if I harvest it?" Sera nodded. "Of course, you're free to do so. However, I need you to make 3 concept potions immediately so we can get some preliminary testing done." "That would be my pleasure." Desmonda's fingers tingled with anticipation as she carefully plucked a few leaves and flowers, then cradled them in her hands as if they were the most precious gems. Then, she returned to the alchemical workshop and set her newly harvested materials on a clean workspace, looking over the array of equipment and ingredients available. Sera watched as Desmonda gathered the necessary components for her potions from her workstation. The air filled with the sound of clinking glass and the hiss of simmering liquids, as the alchemist got to work. The first potion she created was an elixir of euphoria. She ground the Seluna leaves into a fine powder, mixing them with a base of distilled water and a few pinches of other herbs. Finally, she added a few drops of an orange-colored liquid to make the mixture settle. Next, she crafted a stamina potion. This time, she dissolved the petals of the Seluna directly into the mixture with ease. She combined them with essence of night runner vine and a dash of powdered gloom root. The potion took on a brilliant violet color, the hues shifting as it bubbled gently in its flask. For the final potion, Desmonda decided to experiment with a calming draft. She used both the leaves and flowers of the Seluna, infusing them with dream leaf essence. The liquid turned a soft, pale blue, its surface shimmering like moonlight on water. Desmonda stepped back, admiring her work for a bit. Then, she carefully labeled each flask, noting the ingredients and the expected properties. Sera approached the table. "Impressive," she said, picking up the flask containing the elixir of euphoria. She held it up to the light, watching as the liquid sparkled. "These look promising. What do you expect from each of them?" Desmonda took a deep breath, her excitement barely contained. The elixir of euphoria should induce a state of intense joy and happiness, the stamina potion will boost endurance and energy levels, and the calming draft should provide a sense of peace and relaxation, easing stress and anxiety. "Excellent. Do you think these potions are ready for testing?" "Anything can be ready for testing if you want it to, boss." Sera chuckled lightly. "I'll take these potions you made with me then." Sera went down into the prison area. The walls exuded a chill that seeped through her clothing. And the air was thick with the scent of dampness from both water and dried urine. She found Zoha waiting near the entrance, bowing her head lightly. "Welcome back, mistress. Are the test subjects prepared?" Sera asked, her voice low and commanding, each word imbued with authority as they started walking down the narrow corridor. Zoha nodded, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Yes, they are. Everything is ready." "Good, then let's get started." Their footsteps echoed as they approached a heavy iron door. Zoha took out a large, rusted key from the folds of her cloak and inserted it into the lock. A waft of stale air greeted them as the door opened inward, revealing a large cell bathed in the flickering glow of torchlight. Inside, a dozen people huddled together, fearful and confused. Their eyes darted around the room, taking in the grim surroundings, the cold stone walls, and the iron bars that confined them. Sera set down the 3 potions she had brought on a wooden table near the cell's entrance. The glass vials clinked softly against the rough-hewn surface. "Zoha, help me pour the potions into 3 to 4 cups each." "Understood, mistress." The demoness immediately retrieved a set of clean, tarnished metal cups from a nearby shelf. She placed the cups on the table next to the potions, and uncorked each flask with a practiced hand. The scent of the concoctions filled the air, sweet, tangy, and earthy, each with its unique aroma. Meanwhile, Sera turned her attention to a few Black Eagle members who stood nearby. "Gather 12 prisoners and have them stand in a line." The Black Eagles moved immediately as they approached the huddled prisoners. They barked orders, herding the terrified captives into a single-file line. The prisoners shuffled forward, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear as they were forced into position. Zoha, having poured each potion into its respective cup, stood by the table. Sera soon joined her, giving a brief glance over the line of prisoners. She motioned to the first 4, indicating they should step forward. The captives obeyed, trembling as they approached the table. "These first 4 will test the elixir of euphoria," Sera announced, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She nodded to Zoha, who retrieved a cup of the potion for each prisoner. The liquid inside shimmered like molten gold, reflecting it in mesmerizing patterns. Each prisoner grasped their cup with trembling hands, the cool metal stark against their clammy skin. They glanced nervously at one another at first, the faint clinking of their cups the only sound in the heavy silence. But the liquid's sweet scent soon wafted up to their noses, causing them to inhale deeply and momentarily forget their fear. At first, they sipped tentatively, the golden liquid slipping past their lips and caressing their tongues. Their initial hesitation melted away as the elixir's warmth spread through their bodies. Within moments, their expressions softened, the rigid lines of fear dissolving into serene contentment. Their eyes now glazed over with a radiant joy. Soft, dreamy smiles unfurled across their faces, each curve of their lips speaking of profound bliss. "Interesting," Sera murmured. "I expect this one to be quite popular with the general populace. Hopefully, the effects of withdrawal will be just as strong, if not more so." Sera then signaled for the next group of 4 to step forward. "These 4 will test the stamina potion." Zoha handed out the cups filled with the violet liquid. The prisoners drank more readily this time, driven by a mixture of curiosity and resignation. Soon, their eyes brightened with energy, and they shifted restlessly, unable to stand still. "Not too shabby," Sera noted, her gaze sharp as she watched the prisoners' reactions. "This one could be better for adventurers and mercenaries." Afterwards, Sera signaled for the last batch of prisoners to be brought forward. "These 4 will test the calming potion." Zoha distributed the final set of cups, filled with the pale blue liquid. Again the prisoners drank, and soon, a profound sense of calm washed over them. Their tense muscles relaxed, and their frantic, darting eyes softened with tranquility. "Very effective," Sera said. "Perhaps this one should be promoted more towards the nobility and wealthy merchants. Such people often engage in negotiations, and something like this could prove popular." She turned to Zoha, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "It seems we've created some potent potions. Let's observe them for the next few hours to note any additional effects." As time passed, Sera and Zoha continued to monitor the prisoners closely. The first group, under the influence of the elixir of euphoria, began to exhibit signs of overstimulation. Their blissful expressions twisted into manic grins, their bodies twitching with uncontrolled energy. One prisoner let out a hysterical laugh, while another started to dance erratically, unable to contain the overwhelming sensation. "Too potent," Sera commented. "We'll need to adjust the formula to balance the effects." The second group, bolstered by the stamina potion, showed signs of hyperactivity. They paced back and forth, their movements growing more frantic. One prisoner punched the air repeatedly, while another ran around in circles over and over again. "Effective, but we may need to reduce the intensity slightly," Zoha noted, jotting down notes in a small, leather-bound journal. The third group, under the calming draft's influence, appeared to fare the best. They remained tranquil, their expressions serene. However, one prisoner's breathing grew shallow, and their eyelids drooped heavily as if they were on the verge of falling asleep. It would seem that the calming potion appears to be the closest one to perfection so far. Let's get these prisoners back to their cells, Sera instructed the Black Eagles. And Zoha, send a request to Desmunda to prepare some more potions with a few modifications. We have much work ahead of us. Chapter 42 Needs and Wants. Marwood. Frederick wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand, feeling the grit of dried sweat and dust against his skin. As he finished placing the last of the wooden planks, he paused, straightening up to stretch the stiffness from his back. The midday sun hung high overhead, its relentless heat pouring down on the bustling construction site. Dust swirled around him in spirals, kicked up by the steady rhythm of hammers and saws, before settling into the creases of his threadbare clothing. His once vibrant blue shirt had long faded to a dull grey. While he was carrying a few planks of wood, a booming voice cut through from behind, causing him to drop the planks. "Fred! I've had enough of your slacking." Frederick turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the towering figure of his supervisor, Merrick. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, muscles bulging beneath the thin fabric of his shirt, the veins standing out in sharp relief against his tanned skin. "You've been dragging your feet all morning, and I can't afford to have you slowing us down." Fred's heart sank. He hadn't meant to fall behind, but the exhaustion from long hours of back-breaking work was taking its toll. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll work harder, I promise." Merrick leaned in closer. "Promises won't get this building finished. If you can't keep up, I'll find someone who can. Do you understand me?" Fred nodded vigorously, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, sir. I understand." Merrick straightened, his disdainful glare boring into Fred before he turned on his heel and stalked away. The weight of the supervisor's scorn was heavy, but Fred's shoulders sagged with relief as the tension slowly faded. "Fuck me, that was close, I can't lose this job." The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of relentless labor combined with mundane tasks. Fred's muscles burned with exertion, pain searing through his arms and back. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, he had felt like his body was ready to give up on him. While the other workers packed their tools and prepared to head home, Fred approached the paymaster's tent with a sense of dread curling in his stomach. He'd seen Merrick earlier, speaking to the paymaster with a pointed gesture in his direction. When his turn came to collect his wages, the paymaster, a thin, stern-looking man, glanced up at him over the rims of his glasses. "Name?" "Frederick, sir," Fred said, fighting to keep his voice steady. The paymaster looked over the list in front of him, trailing down the parchment until it stopped abruptly. "It appears you've been marked for insufficient work today. No pay." Fred's stomach plummeted. "Please, sir, I worked hard all day. I need the money." "Just the 5 copper pieces as usual, that's all I'm asking for." The paymaster sighed, removing his spectacles and adjusting them briefly. "Rules are rules. If your supervisor says you didn't meet expectations, there's nothing I can do." Desperation twisted in Fred's gut. He couldn't go home empty-handed. "Please, I'll do better tomorrow. I promise. Just this once, give me my wage." The paymaster hesitated, his gaze flicking to Merrick, who stood nearby with his arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. After what felt like an eternity, the paymaster relented. "Fine, but if this happens again, there won't be any more leniency for you." Fred exhaled a sigh of relief as the paymaster counted out 5 copper pieces and handed them over. He clutched the coins tightly in his hand, the cool metal pressing into his palm. "That was way too close." "Thank you, sir," he said. Merrick's eyes bored into Fred as he clutched the coins tightly in his hand. "Just get the fuck out of here. And make sure you earn your keep tomorrow, or you won't be so lucky next time." Fred nodded quickly, murmuring another "thanks, sir," before hastily turning away. As he stepped out of the paymaster's tent, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Damn prick." He tucked the copper coins into his pocket as he made his way through the bustling streets of Marwood. By this time, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobblestone streets. Before long, he arrived at a crowded market. Vendors shouted over each other, while the clatter of carts rolling over uneven stone added to the commotion. Fred navigated through the crowd, shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the gaze of the bustling crowd around him. He first stopped at a stall selling fruits, looking for the cheapest options possible. Hopefully there's some apples around, the kids love those. Fortunately, he did spot some apples that appeared affordable. They were small and bruised, their skins mottled with dark patches, but they were still edible. He reached out and held the fruits with a gentleness born of necessity, carefully selecting a few of the least damaged ones. The vendor watched him with a mix of pity and impatience, eyes narrowing as Fred counted out a few copper pieces before handing them over. With the apples tucked into his pocket, Fred moved on until he reached the butcher's stall. The display was sparse, the best cuts long gone, leaving only the most modest remnants behind. Fred scanned the offerings, his heart sinking as he realized how little was left. He finally settled on a small piece of salted meat, the cheapest cut available. The butcher, a burly man with a thick mustache that twitched as he spoke, handed over the meat without a word, his attention already shifting to the next customer, dismissing Fred as quickly as he had served him. Fred's heart grew heavier as he looked down at his meager purchases. I've already spent all the money I saved up in today's wages. But hopefully, Ruth is feeling generous today. He still needed bread, and there was only one person he knew that would be willing to help him out. Yet, as he made his way to the baker's stall, his hope dwindled further. The stall was nearly empty, the day's supply all but gone. As he approached, the baker, a kind-eyed woman with brown hair tied up in a bun, was in the process of closing up for the day. She glanced up towards him and offered a gentle smile. Evening, Fred. You're cutting it close today. Fred nodded. I know, Ruth. I don't have much left, but I need some bread for my family. Ruth's eyes softened further as she glanced at the remaining loaves. They were stale and unsold, but still very much edible. Tell you what, she said, reaching for the loaves. These are going to waste anyway. You can have them. Fred's eyes filled with gratitude as he accepted the bread. Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to us. Ruth waved away his thanks with a warm smile. Just make sure your kids eat decently tonight. Fred clutched the bread and his other meager purchases close to his chest. After an hour of walking, the bustling market's din faded behind him, giving way to the quieter, more somber atmosphere of the slums. After Fred turned onto a narrow, rutted lane, he passed many houses in various states of disrepair. Crumbling brickwork, windows with peeling paint, and sagging roofs spoke of hard lives and unyielding struggles. The muddy path was riddled with potholes, each step a careful game of avoiding the stagnant puddles that dotted the way. His own home stood at the very end of the lane. Its crumbling brick walls had long since been covered by a patchwork of grime and peeling paint. Meanwhile, the roof was barely put together with mismatched shingles, sagged ominously in places. Home sweet home. When he pushed the shoddy door to his house open, he immediately smelled the scent of cooked meals, dirty fabric, and the distinctive essence of his family. His wife, Anna, was seated at a small, worn table. Her tired eyes lit up with relief the moment they met him. Welcome home, dear. Fred moved closer to kiss her on the forehead. I missed you, sweetheart. Don't worry about me too much, you should see the kids. Their 3 young children were scattered around the room, each absorbed in their own world. Marta, the eldest at 10, sat quietly by the small window, her face illuminated by the last remnants of daylight. She was drawing with a stub of charcoal on a piece of salvaged paper, while 6-year-old Tomas and 4-year-old Lily played with makeshift toys. The instant the door closed behind him, the children's attention snapped to their father as they sprang up from their activities and ran to him. Papa! Fred knelt down slowly, the day's fatigue momentarily forgotten as he gathered his children into a tight embrace. Hey, there's enough of me to go around. He pulled back slightly to look at their faces, each one beaming up at him. Marta's serious eyes, always observant, were alight with a rare happiness. Tomas's energetic grin mirrored the infectious joy of youth, while Lily's shy smile peeked from behind her thumb, which she had absent-mindedly started to suck. I missed you all so much, Fred said, placing a gentle kiss on each of their foreheads. Did you bring us anything, Papa? Tomas asked eagerly, his eyes darting to the bag Fred had set down beside him. Fred chuckled softly, ruffling his son's hair. I did, actually. Some bread and apples for dinner. We'll all eat together. Lily's eyes widened. Yay! Apples! Fred's heart melted at her innocent delight. He glanced up to see Anna setting aside her mending, the needle and thread carefully placed on the small table. She soon rose to join them. All right, everybody. Go play for a bit while I talk to your father. The children reluctantly let go of Fred, their small hands lingering on his arms for a moment longer before they scampered off to their corner of the room. Then, Anna took Fred's hand and leading him to a quieter corner of the room. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Did you get paid?" Fred nodded, reaching into his pocket to show her the coins, their dull gleam catching the light. He also held up the modest food he had managed to buy, the bread, a few bruised apples, and a small piece of meat. "It wasn't easy, but we have something to eat tonight." "Thank you, we'll make do," Anna whispered. They worked together to prepare a simple meal, using the apples, meat and bread to create a modest but nourishing dinner. As they sat around the small table, the children chattered happily, their worries momentarily forgotten. After dinner, Fred and Anna tucked the children into bed. Marta, the eldest, hugged her father tightly. "Good night, Papa," she whispered. "Good night, my sweet," Fred replied, kissing her forehead. He then tucked Tomas and Lily under their worn but warm blankets, giving each a gentle kiss good night. With the children asleep, Fred and Anna retreated to their own small bed. They lay in the darkness, the weight of the day settling over them. Anna rested her head on Fred's chest. "We'll get through this." "I know," Fred whispered back. "I just hope everything will be okay." Long after Anna had fallen asleep, Fred slipped out of bed and moved silently through the small house, careful not to wake anyone. Once outside, he made his way deeper into the slums. He arrived at a dilapidated shack at the edge of the slums and knocked softly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal a man with sharp features and a weary expression. "Freddy, my man, come in." Fred entered, the familiar scent of smoke and sweat filling his nostrils. The two sat at a rickety table, the only light coming from a small, flickering candle. "Baron, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. This job I have is complete shit, but I got no choice but to keep going." "Yeah, I feel you there. Can I offer you a drink?" "I've got some ale," Baron said, lifting up a dusty bottle of mystery liquid that he took from who knows where. Fred shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "Thanks, but no. Alcohol doesn't do it for me anymore." "Listen, I feel you. But I might have something else that can help you unwind, at least for a little while." Fred watched as Baron reached under the table and pulled out a glass bottle filled with a liquid that looked like molten gold. The substance glowed softly in the dim light, casting an eerie yet captivating glow. "What is that?" Fred asked out loud, squinting his eyes. Baron smiled faintly. "Folks have been calling it Angel Tears. It's a new product from the Black Eagles. Says it can make you forget your troubles and feel like nothing else matters." "I don't know about this one, Baron, these potions can be dangerous." "No. I've tried it myself. Just a little won't hurt. It's like nothing you've ever felt before. Trust me." Fred hesitated, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The idea of escaping his worries, even for a brief moment, was incredibly tempting. He watched as Baron uncorked the bottle, the faint pop echoing in the quiet room. The liquid inside shimmered, its golden hue mesmerizing to the eyes. Baron poured a small amount into a tin cup, the liquid flowing smoothly and settling with a slight glow. He then held the cup out to Fred. "Just a sip, try it." Taking a deep breath, Fred accepted the cup. He raised it to his lips, feeling the chill of the liquid as it touched his mouth. He took a cautious sip, the taste surprisingly sweet and smooth, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Almost immediately, a warmth spread through his body, starting from his chest and radiating outward like the gentle embrace of a summer sun. His worries and fatigue melted away, replaced by a profound sense of euphoria that lifted him from the inside out. Fred's eyes widened in amazement as the potion took effect. The dim, shadowy room around him seemed to brighten, colors becoming more vivid and details sharper. Every sound, from the creak of the wooden floorboards to the distant murmur of voices outside, was clearer, more distinct, as if the world had been tuned to a perfect pitch. A blissful smile spread across his face as he turned to look at Baron, his friend's features appearing more defined and vibrant. "Holy shit, what's in this stuff?" Baron nodded, his own smile reflecting Fred's newfound joy. "I told you. It's like nothing else." For the first time in what felt like ages, Fred felt truly happy. He knew the effects of the angel tears wouldn't last, but for now, he allowed himself to revel in the moment, savoring the fleeting escape from his struggles. "Damn, this is some good stuff." Fred looked at Baron again. "How did you get your hands on this?" Bayron leaned back in his chair and let out a blissful smile. The Black Eagles were actually distributing them for free, so I took my shot. Do you think taking free stuff from them is a good idea? I mean, nothing from them comes without a price. I know it'll probably screw me later, but a good time is a good time. Sometimes you need to grab what little joy you can find, even if it comes with strings attached. You're not worried about what they'll ask for in return? Fred asked, setting the cup down carefully on the table. Bayron's smile faded slightly. Of course I am. But think about it, Fred. We break our backs every day for scraps. We can't always afford to be picky about where our relief comes from. I'm tired of feeling like I'm drowning every second of the day. This, he gestured to the glowing bottle, gives me a chance to come up for air, even if it's just for a moment. Fred nodded slowly, understanding but not entirely convinced. The warmth of the potion continued to spread through him, loosening the tight knots of worry and fatigue that had become a constant in his life. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes close for a moment. All right, but can you at least tell me how long you have been using this stuff? A couple of weeks. The first time I tried it, I was hooked. It's hard to go back to feeling like crap all the time once you've had a taste of this. Shit, this was a bad idea after all. Fred, relax, life's shit anyway. We should take what we can get. Chapter 43 Prosperity. Black Eagle's Hideout, Underground Arena. Sera sat at the head of the long, polished oak table in a dimly lit room, with only a few candles flickering in their sconces. She took a deep breath, looking over the faces of Kieran, Jarek, Ilera, and Myra, each seated around the table with a sense of anticipation in their eyes. Zoha is currently out on recon, Sera said, her gaze lingering on each of them in turn. So, she won't be joining us today. Are there any questions before we start? Nobody said a word. Kieran eventually nodded towards Sera, signaling her to go ahead. She adjusted a stack of parchment in front of her, aligning the edges meticulously before continuing. If there's nothing of note, let's move on to the meeting proper. Sera leaned forward slightly. The first order of business is discussing the performance of the various potions that I've developed with the help of our resident alchemist, Desmunda. Kieran coughed into his hand before speaking up. Angel's Tears have been performing exceptionally well, and we've sold out every single batch we've made within a few days. The only thing holding us back is the fact we're not able to scale to meet demand as of yet. Sera nodded, her quill gliding smoothly across the parchment, leaving behind a thin trail of ink as she made a careful note. She paused for a moment, gaze shifting from the parchment to the and then towards Jarek, who sat across the table from her. And what about the potion we're marketing towards adventurers? Jarek leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. If you're referring to purple poison, it's been well received by adventurers. Pardon? Is our potion actually named purple poison? Originally, we tried to call it something like Violet Rush. But our customers kept calling it purple poison instead, so we just stuck with it. Fair enough, and are there any side effects that we should be concerned about? Nothing too big, boss. Some rashes here and there, persistent coughing, and temporary blindness in extreme cases. But are adventurers still buying the potions? Oh definitely, most people don't get any side effects, and they like how much of a boost purple poison gives them. Excellent, now, let's discuss the last potion then. The one we chose to promote to merchants and nobles. Ilera leaned forward slightly, her fingers brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she prepared to speak. Regarding the potion we've been promoting to merchants and nobles, it has been positively received by those who have tried it, however, the uptake has been a bit slower than what we anticipated. Why do you think that's the case? Sera asked. The merchants, in particular, aren't yet convinced about the product. It's not that they doubt its quality or effectiveness, those who have tested it have given favorable feedback. They're just wary of investing in something new without a proven market demand. They want to see more widespread adoption among the nobles before they fully commit. Ilera said. She paused, glancing at the others around the table before returning her gaze to Sera. We're working on getting around to them, establishing more direct lines of communication and offering incentives for bulk purchases. If we can win over the merchants, the nobles will likely follow, as they often rely on the merchants' endorsements before making decisions themselves. Sera listened intently, tapping a finger lightly on the table's surface as she considered Ilera's words. I see, she finally said, her voice thoughtful. It's a matter of perception and timing, then. We'll need to find a way to push through that initial reluctance. Perhaps some more in-person demonstration or a limited time offer could help promote the product. I'll look into it, boss. Sera took a moment to organize her thoughts before continuing. Next, let's discuss the newest and most important part of our operations, the funnel to my dungeon. Myra, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. We've been working hard on this, and so far, we've worked with several wagon drivers and managed to transport about 10 to 30 people a day into the dungeon. That's not too bad, but I'd like to see those numbers increase in the future. How is the incentive system doing? As you requested, boss, we've made sure that at least 1 in 10 people make it out of the dungeon alive and with potions, free of charge. Sera tilted her head slightly. That sounds good, but are we still charging people for transport? Myra nodded. Yes, we do charge a few copper pieces. Not enough to make a huge profit, but it does give us a slight margin to work with. It covers the basic costs of operation. Sera considered this for a moment. Even a minor fee could prevent some people from wanting to go into the dungeon. After a brief pause, she turned back to Myra. Cut the costs entirely. Make transport to the dungeon free for those who seek Angel's Tears or any of our other potions. We need to lower the barriers to entry if we want to increase foot traffic. With all due respect, I'm not sure if that's the best idea, boss. Oh? How come? Myra's brow furrowed in thought for a few moments. It's a bit of an open secret that the wagon drivers take the fees for themselves. We usually let it slide though, because it keeps them in check. I understand, that is indeed a fair point. In that case, keep things as is for now, at least until I can think of something better. Understood, boss. Sera gave a satisfied nod before shifting her attention to the rest of the group. Now, for the last agenda of this meeting, let's discuss the number of recent recruits and how the process is going so far. Kieran straightened in his seat. We've brought in a good number of new members, and most of them are settling in well. That said, we're still in the early stages, and there's a lot of work to be done to ensure they're fully integrated into the Black Eagles. Just make sure the training remains rigorous. Continue to monitor their progress closely, and if there are any extreme issues, inform me or Zoha in the future. We'll keep a close eye on it, boss. With that, Sera leaned back in her chair. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the meeting's discussion settle in her mind. Thank you, everyone. We've made good progress so far, let's keep the momentum going. Sera's dungeon, Mystic Forest. It had been a few days since Sera had been inside of her own dungeon. Aside from the spirit tree itself, she wanted to check on the beastkin who were now staying here. Let's hope they don't have too many questions for me. She soon approached the secluded alcove where Ermo, Alpa, and Faye had made their home. The house had changed quite a bit since she last created it. The once purely organic design had been altered with deliberate changes that were evident in every detail. Although thick roots formed the walls, they had been pruned, shaped, and coaxed, their once wild spirals now forming a more uniform shape. Some of the soil surrounding the house had been plowed and tilled, leaving neat rows that bordered the structure like a carefully laid-out garden. Above the doorway, the vines had been cultivated rather than allowed to grow wild, their blossoms blooming in carefully chosen spots. The vibrant colors of the flowers, deep purples, rich reds, and bright yellow stood out against the color of the wood. Sera paused at the entrance, brushing a hand near the wooden door. She could sense the presence of Ermo, Alpa, and Faye, each with their own distinct energy. Now or never. She pushed the door open gently, the wood giving way with a soft creak, and stepped inside. The interior of the house now included a few carefully placed oil lamps to serve as lighting. Not only that, even the furniture had been personalized with the touch of its inhabitants. The chairs had been draped with woven fabrics, their soft, earthy tones adding warmth to the space. Meanwhile, sturdy shelves carved by hand were also present, lined with various trinkets, tools, and small keepsakes. Only moments after Sera entered, Faye was the first to notice her. "Auntie Sera," she exclaimed, bouncing up from where she had been sitting on the floor, playing with a small, wooden toy. Sera smiled warmly, bending down to catch Faye in a gentle hug. "Hello, little one," she said softly as she looked down at the young girl. "Have you been helping Ermo and Alpa with the house?" Faye nodded enthusiastically. "I helped decorate. Do you like it?" Sera looked around the room, taking in the thoughtful touches that had been added since she last visited. "You've done a wonderful job." Alpa, who had been arranging some herbs on the table, looked up and smiled at Sera. She's been quite the little helper. The soft clatter of wooden utensils and the scent of a hearty stew simmering wafted through the doorway as Ermo emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a well-worn cloth. His eyes softened as they landed on Sera, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Hey boss, been a good while." Sera returned the smile in kind. "This place has turned out quite nicely. Alpa and Faye did most of the work. I just made sure things didn't fall apart," Ermo said, chuckling softly. Alpa grinned over her shoulder. "Don't let him fool you. He's done a lot more than he lets on." Meanwhile Faye, clinging to Sera's hand, looked up with eager eyes. "Auntie Sera, are you staying for dinner?" Sera's smile softened as she looked down at the girl. "Maybe next time, I have some other things to take care of first." Faye's excitement dimmed slightly, but she nodded, her grip loosening. "Okay." Afterwards, Sera turned to Ermo. "Actually, could we talk for a moment? In private?" The beastkin man's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, boss." He turned to Alpa and Faye, offering them a reassuring smile. "We'll be right back." Alpa waved them off, her knowing smile hinting that she understood more than she let on. "Take your time. We'll keep things warm." Faye, still a little disappointed, gave a small wave. "Come back soon, Auntie Sera." Sera offered one last smile to the girl before following Ermo outside. Once they were a good distance away from the house, Ermo stopped, turning to face Sera with a more serious expression. "So, what's on your mind, boss? Tell me, have you been outside the mystic forest much lately?" Sera asked. "Not much. I stick close to Alpa and Faye. But I've noticed more adventurers coming through the dungeon. More than usual. And have you seen what happens to them?" Ermo fell silent. His gaze dropped to the ground, hands clenched into fists. After a long moment, he exhaled deeply. "Yeah, I've seen it. But I try not to think about it too much." Sera's expression softened slightly, but there was a steely edge to her voice. "There will be more of them coming, and it's only going to get more dangerous." "I know, boss. I don't want Faye to see any of that. She's too young to understand what really happens here." "Thank you for understanding. I know it's not easy." Ermo gave a small, tight-lipped smile. "As long as Alpa is safe too, I'll do what I can." Sera nodded, hand slipping from his shoulder as she took a step back. "I know you will. Now, I should let you get back to them. I have a few matters of my own to see." Ermo nodded in return, turning his attention back toward the house. "Take care, boss." With a final wave, Sera bid them farewell and started walking towards the spirit tree. It should have absorbed quite a decent amount of experience by now. Before long, the towering trunk of the spirit tree came into view. "It feels odd seeing it like this. Not too long ago, the spirit tree was just a small sapling. The roots of the tree spread out around its base, thick and gnarled, weaving through the earth in a complex network that connected every corner of the dungeon." Sera approached the tree, feeling the hum of power growing stronger with each step until she finally reached its base. Turning her back against the massive trunk, Sera closed her eyes and allowed herself to sink into the tree's energy. She felt the connection between herself and the dungeon deepen, the magic of the spirit tree merging with her own essence, feeding into her core. Core experience updated to 30,000. Rank up requirement from rank 4 to rank 5, 25,000 experience. Initiate rank up sequence? "Yes," Sera whispered. Rank up sequence initiated. For a brief moment, the air around her seemed to still, the world pausing as the power of the spirit tree surged through her. Then, she felt the rush of energy as the dungeon itself shifted. Rank up sequence complete. Displaying dungeon status. Core rank, 5. Core experience, 5,000. Dungeon boss, Sera. Number of floors, 4. Mana, 1,200/1,600, 400 currently used for monster maintenance. Monsters, 33. New features unlocked, new terrain option, unlock D-tier monster. After all was said and done, the spirit tree grew taller, though not as drastically as before. Interesting, perhaps. Notice. Effective immediately, the experience required to rank up the spirit tree will increase significantly. Furthermore, the value of experience gained from lower quality tributes will be reduced. Sera paused as she took in the information. Looks like my work will only become more difficult from here on out. No matter, acquiring more tributes shouldn't be too difficult now that I have full control over the Black Eagles. Then, she decided to examine the new terrain options she now has access to. Basic theme, default option, unique passive, none. Stone Maze, rank 2 option, unique passive, minor bonus to adventurer's fear. Glow Moss Cavern, rank 3 option, unique passive, slight possibility that glimmer cap mushrooms will sporadically emerge over time. White Forest, rank 4 option, unique passive, this terrain option comes with 4 frost banshees. These frost banshees are self-sustaining and do not require mana for maintenance. They have a respawn time of 12 hours, restriction, this terrain can be applied to only 1 out of every 4 floors in the dungeon. Blighted Swamp, rank 5 option, unique passive, gradually depletes the stamina of adventurers, with the draining effect increasing cumulatively over time, restriction, this terrain cannot be applied to consecutive floors. Sera's eyes lingered on the Blighted Swamp option. The idea of creating such a hostile environment intrigued her, especially with the restrictions it imposed. But first, I need to know what it would cost to unlock a new floor. How much does it cost to unlock a new floor? She asked. Cost to unlock a new floor, 2,000 core experience. Sera nodded, this price is reasonable enough. But before she committed to expanding the dungeon's physical space, she wanted to explore the potential of adding a more powerful monster to her arsenal. Display monster unlock options, she instructed. Displaying monster unlock options. Unlock 1 random F-tier monster, cost, 100 core experience. Unlock 1 random E-tier monster, cost, 500 core experience. Unlock 1 random D-tier monster, cost, 1000 core experience. Sera considered her options briefly before making her decision. I'd like to unlock a random D-tier monster first. Unlock 1 random D-tier monster selected. Processing request. New monster unlocked, Greater Blight Frog. Level range, 90 to 100. Maintenance cost, 100 mana. Respawn time, 2 hours. Description: the Greater Blight Frog has venomous skin that weakens and drains the stamina of its prey, while its powerful legs allow it to ambush with precision. Highly territorial, this creature can deter intruders with its paralyzing bite. Sera's eyes brightened with satisfaction. Not too bad, I should consider getting a few of these to protect the dungeon. Satisfied, Sera turned her attention to the next task at hand, constructing the new floor and applying the Blighted Swamp terrain. She closed her eyes, connecting deeply with the core of her dungeon, feeling its pulse align with her own. With a deliberate, steady breath, she willed the dungeon to expand. Are you sure you wish to create a new floor? Yes. Where do you wish to place the floor? You are currently on the 4th floor. Place the new floor just above the White Forest, please. Do you wish to place any monsters in the new floor? Spawn 6 blight frogs there. Processing request. The ground beneath Sera's feet rumbled. She closed her eyes, feeling the pulse of the dungeon synchronize with her own heartbeat, the connection between them growing stronger with every passing second. But with time, the shaking ceased. And a new notification manifested. New floor construction complete. Blighted Swamp terrain successfully implemented. Blight frogs have been deployed. Her work done, Sera took a moment to review her own status, curious about how her recent efforts had affected her abilities. She called up her profile, and the information appeared before her in a glowing display. Name, Sera. Species, Elder Dryad. Access privilege, Administrator. Level, 300. Magic, 300, rating, S. Magic resistance, 300, rating, S. Physical defense, 100, rating, C. Strength, 50, rating, E. Speed, 150, rating, B. Vitality, 300, rating, S. Overall challenge rating, S. Alert, Level 4 Winter Path Progression ability available. Processing Level 4 Winter Path Progression reward. New Winter Path ability unlocked, Dark Frost Cocoon. Description: Sera encases herself in a shell of dark, mystical ice, rapidly healing her wounds while emitting an aura of freezing energy that damages all nearby creatures. While inside the cocoon, Sera is immune to all external attacks and effects. The ice rapidly absorbs ambient energy, converting it into life force to restore Sera's health. Restriction: Dark Frost Cocoon can only be activated once per day and lasts for up to 16 seconds. During this time, Sera is immobile and cannot perform any actions. Chapter 44 Nostalgia. Haziel sat alone in a sparse room, perched on a wooden chair that creaked beneath her slight weight. The table in front of her was marred with scratches, and it was surrounded by the oppressive presence of iron bars that cast long shadows across the stone floor. The air was heavy, almost stifling, thick with the scent of damp stone and old wood, the kind of scent that seeped into one's bones and settled there. Soon, the door creaked open. A familiar figure stepped into the room, his presence commanding and imposing. Chancellor Alistair was draped in a dark embroidered robe. His silver hair, meticulously combed back, framed a face that was both stern and calculating. His piercing blue eyes appeared to bore into the air itself. At the very least, it did make many of the acolytes flinch. With a measured stride, the Chancellor crossed the room and took his seat beside Haziel. He adjusted his robe with a flick of his wrist before turning to her with an unreadable expression. "You should be grateful that I've taken the time to visit you. Time, as you know, is a precious commodity for someone in my position." Haziel inclined her head slightly. "I understand, Chancellor. But may I ask, why have you come to see me?" The Chancellor's gaze didn't waver as he studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've heard from the Inquisition that you were last seen in a flower shop. Why were you there?" Haziel hesitated, absently tracing the edge of the table's surface with a finger. "I just felt like going there." A heavy sigh escaped Alistair's lips. "Do you remember what your mission is, Haziel?" She furrowed her brow, trying to pull the fragmented memories together, but they slipped through her. After a moment, she shook her head. I can't remember." The Chancellor's expression softened just a fraction, though it was more pity than compassion. Rising to his feet slowly, he placed a hand on her shoulder with a cold and impersonal touch. "Come with me, I think you're simply exhausted. And I know just how to fix that." His words lingered in the air as he turned towards the door, leaving Haziel with little choice but to follow. "I hope whatever happens won't be too bad. I really don't want to hurt anyone." Haziel followed Chancellor Alistair out of the sparse room as they walked down a long, dimly lit corridor. She had no idea where they were going, but an increasing sense of dread kept clawing at her mind. Soon, they arrived at a heavy wooden door. Alistair pushed it open, revealing a room that was sterile, almost clinical, with gleaming white walls and a polished floor that reflected the harsh overhead lights. Haziel took in the sight of various acolytes bustling about the room. Strange equipment filled the room, arcane instruments that buzzed and glowed with unnatural light, vials filled with swirling liquids, and bundles of herbs laid out in precise rows. "Sit," Chancellor Alistair ordered, gesturing towards a large metal chair at the center of the room. Thick, heavy straps dangled from the arms and legs, strong enough to restrain even the most defiant prisoner. Haziel's breath hitched as her eyes traced the contours of the chair. She felt a tremor in her hands but forced herself to move, knowing that hesitation would only worsen her situation. With a final glance at Alistair's unyielding expression, she lowered herself into the chair. The icy metal bit into her back, the sensation jolting through her body. It was hard and unyielding, the seat designed not for comfort but for control. No sooner had she settled into the chair than the acolytes moved in. Their hands moved fast as they wrapped the thick ropes around her wrists and ankles. The fibers were rough against her skin, tightening with each pull until she was bound securely to the chair. Still, despite it all, Haziel couldn't hold back her curiosity. "Is this all necessary?" "It's all for your own good," Chancellor Alistair said. He stepped back, watching as the acolytes finished their work, adjusting the straps and checking the equipment. Once they were satisfied, one of the acolytes, a stern-faced woman, approached Alistair and handed him a large, leather-bound book. He accepted it with a nod, coughing lightly into his hand before turning his attention back to Haziel. "I'm going to speak certain words now. As I do, I want you to focus on remembering your true purpose. Do you understand?" Haziel winced in pain for some odd reason she couldn't understand, but regardless, she answered why yes. Chancellor Alistair opened the book, tracing the ancient symbols etched into its pages. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an oppressive energy. The acolytes formed a silent circle around the chair, their eyes fixed on the Chancellor as he chanted. "Rose, whisper, thunder, mirror, shadow, glass." The words seemed to linger in the air, each syllable vibrating with an unsettling energy. Haziel felt the sound wrap around her, a soft, insistent whisper that caressed the edges of her mind. A strange sensation followed, a creeping drowsiness that began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. It started at the edges of her awareness, a faint tug that grew stronger with every passing second. Her eyelids fluttered, the muscles in her face growing slack as if they were no longer under her control. She blinked, trying to clear her mind, but it was like moving through thick syrup. Her thoughts were sluggish, each one coming slower than the last. River, flame, silence. Chancellor Alistair's voice drifted through the fog, the words growing fainter with each repetition. They reverberated in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her consciousness before fading into the distance. The room itself seemed to pull away, the walls stretching into shadows that swallowed the light. Haziel's breath hitched in her throat. But the pull of sleep was too strong, a tidal wave that overwhelmed her, dragging her down into its depths. Her body went limp against the restraints, the ropes holding her upright as her last bit of strength ebbed away. Haziel stirred awake, senses gradually coming back to her like the slow blooming of a flower at dawn. She became aware of a series of gentle tugs on her clothes, each one persistent yet soft, as though something small and curious were trying to rouse her. The sensation reminded her of a kitten's playful nudge, delicate but insistent. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw were several small faces peering up at her, their features blurred at first but quickly sharpening as her vision cleared. The children surrounded her, their wide eyes filled with both concern and curiosity. They were of various ages, cheeks flushed a rosy pink from the cold. The children wore soft woolen sweaters, and threadbare scarves that had clearly seen many winters. The smallest of the group, a little girl with chestnut curls that tumbled haphazardly around her face, was the first to speak. "Sister Haziel, are you okay?" Haziel managed a gentle smile, though she winced slightly as a dull ache throbbed in her temples. She reached up with one hand, massaging the side of her head in a slow, circular motion, trying to ease the tension that pulsed behind her eyes. "I'm fine, thanks. Just a bit of a headache, but nothing to worry about." The children visibly relaxed, their small bodies unwinding from the tense postures they had unconsciously adopted. One of the older boys, who had a freckled face that seemed permanently set in a half-grin, stepped forward. He pointed to Haziel's robe, his finger hovering just above the coarse fabric. "Sister Haziel, you've got something on your clothes." Haziel chuckled softly. "Oh, Mark, I know you're just trying to trick me again," she teased, shaking her head. "You always love to pull my leg, don't you?" But Mark's grin faded slightly. "No, really, Sister Haziel, there's something there. You should get it changed." The other children nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same sincerity. Haziel's curiosity was piqued, and she glanced down at her robe, her fingers brushing over the rough, worn material. She didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the children's insistence was enough to make her pause. All right, she conceded with a light sigh. "I'll go get changed." Mark's eyes lit up, and he beckoned her to follow him. The other children clustered around as they led her out of the small room and down a narrow, drafty hallway. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent halls. When they reached another room, Haziel noticed a faint glow of candlelight spilling from beneath the door. The children were trembling with excitement for some reason. Haziel just shrugged as they pushed the door open. Why are they so excited? The room was humble, its simplicity a reflection of the austere life led by those who gathered there. A few priestesses, priests, and nuns stood clustered around a small, worn table, their figures bathed in the gentle light of the lone candle that flickered at its center. The candle, slightly crooked in its holder, cast long, wavering shadows on the whitewashed walls. A modest spread of food had been carefully arranged on the table. 2 small loaves of bread sat beside a pot of steaming broth, and at the center of it all was a single, slightly lopsided cake, dusted with a light snowfall of powdered sugar. The cake was simple, yet it had been crafted with obvious care and love, a labor of devotion in the midst of a harsh winter. As Haziel stepped into the room, the gathered clergy turned toward her, their faces breaking into soft, cheerful smiles. "Surprise, Sister Haziel," they cheered all at once. Her heart swelled with emotion as she took in the scene before her. The effort they had gone to, despite the scarcity of the season, touched her deeply. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she looked around the room, her gaze settling on each familiar face. She recognized the lines of worry etched into their brows, the way their hands were chapped from the cold, yet their smiles were genuine and full of light. "Thank you," Haziel whispered, her voice thick with emotion, the words barely able to escape the lump in her throat. "Thank you all so much." The modest celebration continued with a gentle, heartwarming joy that filled the small room. Haziel smiled as the children gathered around the simple cake. The flickering candlelight cast a warm glow over their eager faces, making the modest feast feel more like a grand banquet in their innocent eyes. The priestesses and priests joined in the quiet celebration, sharing stories and laughter that echoed softly off the stone walls. The cold air outside was forgotten for a time, replaced by the warmth of companionship and the sweetness of shared moments. As the evening wore on, the children, now drowsy and full from the modest meal, were gently herded towards their bedrooms by the nuns. Their sleepy protests were met with soft, soothing words, and the gentle rustle of their footsteps echoed through the dimly lit halls. The room began to empty, the warm, familial chatter gradually giving way to the quiet of the night. Haziel was about to retire for the evening when she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. She turned to see a tall priest standing beside her. His weathered face, edged with deep lines from years of hardship, seemed softened by the dim candlelight, yet his eyes betrayed a deep-seated worry that could not be hidden. His hair, once a rich brown, was now streaked with silver, and his thin, worn robe hung loosely on his frame. "Sister Haziel," he began, his voice low and tentative. "Might we speak for a moment?" Haziel nodded, sensing the gravity of what he wished to discuss. "Of course, Father Donovan. Let's find a quieter place." Together, the two walked through the monastery until they came to a small alcove with a narrow window, the only source of light in the otherwise shadowed space. The window was frosted over, the intricate patterns of ice forming a delicate, crystalline lattice that obscured the view of the bleak landscape beyond. Father Donovan paused by the window, his gaze fixed on the frost-covered glass. His breath misted in the cold air as he spoke. "The winter hasn't stopped for nearly a year now. The snow just keeps falling, the cold growing deeper with each passing day. It's as if the world itself is frozen, trapped in an endless cycle of darkness and cold." Haziel reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Father, I know this winter has been hard on all of us. But we must hold on to our faith. The Lord Zephyro has not abandoned us. He will see us through this trial, just as he always has." Father Donovan sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. "I want to believe that, Sister Haziel, truly I do. But the crops have failed, the animals are dying, and our people are suffering. This winter, it feels different, more than just a season. It feels like a curse, like something is deeply wrong with the world. Our faith in the Lord Zephyro will not be in vain, Father Donovan. We are being tested, yes, but we must remain steadfast. The Lord's light will break through this darkness, I promise you. I pray you're right, sister. But it's hard to see the light when the world is covered in snow and ice." Just as Haziel was about to respond, a sudden chill swept through the alcove, far colder than anything they had felt that evening. It was a biting, unnatural cold that felt like it was ready to pierce through her very bones. She turned her gaze toward the narrow window, eyes widening as she noticed something deeply unsettling. Thick layers of frost were creeping inward, seeping through the very walls of the monastery. The once intricate patterns of ice had begun to spread, their crystalline tendrils slowly but steadily encroaching on the stone walls. "This is very bad." Her fingers tightened around Father Donovan's arm, the urgency in her grip pulling him away from the window. "Father, we need to move, something is not right here." Chapter 45 Sheer Cold. Haziel's heart pounded in her chest. She pulled Father Donovan along as the chill from the creeping frost seeped deeper through her skin. Her breath came in short, sharp puffs, each exhale visible in the freezing air. The corridor stretched out before them, shadows lengthening as they hurried forward. The weight of fear pressed down on Haziel, but she refused to let it slow her down. But soon, she rounded a corner and pushed open a heavy wooden door, heart filled with the desperate hope of finding refuge or perhaps other survivors. "I really hope the kids are okay." Yet, as soon as she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat, and the world felt like it tilted beneath her feet. "What is this?" Several nuns and children stood frozen in place, encased in ice that glittered cruelly in the dim light. The ice was not the delicate frost that had once adorned the monastery windows, it was thick, pale, and merciless, covering every inch of their bodies with a smooth sheen. They were trapped in mid-motion, eyes wide and lifeless, as if they had been caught in the grip of terror in their final moments. The ice was so clear, so glass-like, that it seemed almost surreal, as though the scene had been carved from the coldest crystal. It captured every detail, how a nun's hand was outstretched, as if reaching for help that would never come, the tear frozen on a child's cheek, glistening like a jewel in the harsh light. Haziel felt her stomach twist with horror, struggling to process the scene before her. The cold was oppressive, pressing down on her, and she could feel it creeping into her soul. This is too much. Haziel's hand flew to her mouth as she staggered back. These were the same children she had seen laughing and celebrating just moments ago, the same nuns who had comforted and cared for them. Now, they were frozen statues, lives extinguished and encased in an unyielding tomb of ice. She turned away abruptly, bile rising in her throat, the bitter taste of fear burning in her mouth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she instinctively reached for Father Donovan, her only thought to drag him out of this nightmare and away from the creeping frost that had claimed so many. But as she tugged on his arm, she felt an unexpected resistance, a terrible, unyielding force that stopped her cold. Haziel's gaze dropped to the ground as she took in the sight before her. Father Donovan's legs were already encased in ice. The frost was spreading rapidly, its cold tendrils winding around his thighs, locking him in place as it climbed higher, inch by inch. No. Haziel said, tightening her grip on his arm. Father, I can save you. We have to move, we have to get out of here. But even as she spoke, the ice moved too quickly. It crept higher, consuming everything in its path with a merciless chill. Father Donovan's legs were already imprisoned in the freezing vice, the ice climbing steadily upward, encasing him in its deadly embrace. He reached out and clasped her hand with his own. Despite the numbing chill, there was a warmth in his touch that almost transcended the physical. Sister Haziel. There's no time. My time is up. You must go. Haziel shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, blurring her vision as she desperately tried to pull him free. No, I won't leave you. I can't. The ice had reached his chest now, creeping ever closer to his heart. He looked at her, his eyes softening with a mix of sorrow and pride, a gentle smile touching his lips despite the harshness of his situation. You must, the world needs you. Father Donovan's lips barely moved as he whispered his final words, the sound barely audible over the crackling of the encroaching ice. I'm proud of you. His words were cut off as the ice solidified around his mouth and eyes, freezing him in mid-sentence. Haziel stared in horror as Father Donovan was transformed into another frozen statue, hands still clasped around hers. A sob caught in her throat, but she forced herself to let go of his icy hand. She turned away, tears streaming down her face, and ran. She fled down the corridors of the monastery, the once familiar walls now a maze of shadows and creeping frost. The cold bit at her heels, but she pushed forward, refusing to let it claim her as it had the others. I just need to leave this place. She burst through the monastery's heavy wooden doors and out into the open air, only to stop dead in her tracks. The world outside was a swirling maelstrom of white. Snow whipped through the air in a relentless blizzard, the wind howling like a banshee. But it wasn't the storm that stopped her, it was the figure standing in the midst of it. A woman stood at the center of the storm, commanding an otherworldly presence. Her eyes were like twin orbs of silvery light, luminous and devoid of any warmth or emotion. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, glowing faintly against the backdrop of the blizzard. She wore a gown as white as the snow, blending seamlessly with the raging storm around her. Her white hair reached only to her shoulders, and from her forehead jutted two antlers made entirely of ice, glinting with an eerie light. Haziel felt a chill deeper than any she had felt before, one that reached into her very soul. Despite this, she steeled herself and called out over the howling wind, "Are you the one who did all this?" The woman's gaze shifted to Haziel, her expression cold and detached, as if she were looking at something insignificant. I am, the question is, what are you going to do about it? In an instant, the sky above split open with a deafening roar. The heavens themselves trembled as a massive bolt of red lightning tore through the clouds, a jagged spear of raw energy that struck Haziel with blinding force. Pain and power surged through her in a violent torrent, overwhelming her senses, flooding every fiber of her being with a primal energy. The shock of it jolted her to the core, the electricity coursing through her veins like liquid fire. When the searing light finally faded, Haziel found herself hovering in midair, her wings unfurled in a glorious display of power. They glowed with an intense red light, each feather humming with the residual energy of the lightning that had struck her. She was clad in brilliant red armor, the metal shining like freshly forged steel, pulsing with the same crackling energy that coursed through her. She gripped a sword in each hand, the twin blades sparking and crackling with the red lightning that had infused her. The fear that had gripped her moments before was gone, burned away by the fierce determination that now surged through her. Her eyes locked onto the woman below. Hatred and resolve burned in her gaze as she spoke. I'm going to kill you, here and now. The woman smiled. Do try your best. The raw energy coursing through Haziel's veins urged her forward, wings beating with such force that they sent ripples through the stormy sky. She descended upon the woman with blinding speed, her twin blades poised to strike. Soon, the angel plunged her swords into the woman's chest and stomach. The blades sliced through the air with deadly accuracy, but instead of meeting the resistance of flesh and bone, Haziel felt her weapons pass through nothingness. Her eyes widened in shock as the woman's form shimmered, her outline wavering like a mirage before dissolving into mist that swirled and dissipated, leaving Haziel's swords to swing uselessly through the empty space. What just happened? A cold laugh echoed through the storm, chilling Haziel more than the icy winds ever could. She spun around, only to find the woman standing behind her, untouched and unfazed. I find you quite interesting, we should talk. Without hesitation, Haziel lunged at her again. But once again, the woman's form dissipated into fine snow that quickly turned to mist. The woman's voice drifted through the blizzard, tinged with a mocking curiosity. Care to explain why an angel like yourself is staying with humans? She appeared casually at the edge of Haziel's vision, walking slowly as if this were nothing more than a leisurely stroll. Haziel hesitated, her grip tightening on her swords. She kept her silence, her gaze never leaving the woman, who simply sighed and shook her head in mild disappointment. Are you really just going to stay quiet? The woman asked. Haziel's resolve hardened. She shot upward, wings propelling her into the sky as she scanned the ground below. The storm raged on, but Haziel's focus was sharp, eyes searching for any sign of the woman's true location. Then she spotted it, just a faint silhouette behind a frost-covered tree, almost hidden by the blizzard. Without a second thought, she dove down with her swords raised, and drove them through the bark and into the woman hiding behind it. This time, she felt the satisfying resistance of flesh yielding to her blades, the crunch of bone and sinew as they pierced through. The woman gasped, her expression faltering for the first time as she stared down at the swords embedded in her body. Yet, despite it all, she remained completely calm. Why won't you just die? Haziel snarled. The woman's response was a faint smile that barely touched her lips. You should check your swords. Haziel's gaze snapped down to her weapons, and her breath caught in her throat. The red lightning that once crackled with fierce energy around the blades was now encased in a rapidly spreading layer of ice. The frost crept along them with an unnatural speed, devouring the vibrant energy until it was smothered entirely. This shouldn't even be possible. Panic surged through Haziel as she watched the ice overtake her swords, freezing them solid before she could even react. With a sharp intake of breath, the angel released her grip, fingers numb with the shock of what she was witnessing. She pulled her hands back just in time, the ice crawling up the hilts, reaching for her, but missing by mere inches. Taking cautious steps back, Haziel's eyes flickered between the frozen swords and the woman who had so effortlessly disarmed her. The cold seeped into Haziel's bones, but it was the woman's calm demeanor that sent a shiver down her spine. What in the world are you? And why are you here? Haziel demanded. In response, icy vines erupted from the ground, snaking around the frozen swords and pulling them into the earth as if they were reclaiming what belonged to the frost. The woman stepped away from the tree, her wounds already closing as her flesh knitted back together with eerie speed. She walked toward Haziel with an air of unshakable confidence. I am Amaryllis, an Elder Dryad, and the essence of winter incarnate. Haziel's eyes narrowed. You're nothing more than a heartless monster who kills innocents. Amaryllis didn't flinch at the insult. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her silvery eyes gleaming with a cold, unreadable light. Such venom! But tell me, why does an angel, one meant to be a being of purity and light, choose to live among humans? Why forsake your own kind? Haziel clenched her fists, wings beating with an agitated energy that crackled with red lightning. That's none of your business, she spat, and with a burst of determination, she launched herself at Amaryllis, aiming to strike her down. But as she tried to move, she felt a sudden, immobilizing cold wrap around her feet. She looked down in horror to see icy vines coiling up from the ground, binding her feet in place and freezing them solid. Amaryllis watched with a faint, almost bored smile as Haziel struggled against her icy restraints. With a casual wave of her hand, she conjured a small, smooth boulder made of pure ice and gracefully sat down upon it. It seems you're not going anywhere, Angel. But don't worry, I'm not in a hurry. I've done so much already. Haziel gritted her teeth. You're the one responsible for this endless winter, aren't you? Amaryllis nodded without hesitation. Yes. The long winter is my doing. It's been quite the endeavor, spreading my influence across this land, freezing everything in my path. Haziel's heart sank at the confirmation, though it was what she had expected. Why? Why would you do this? What do you gain from causing so much suffering? It's not about gain, at least not in the way you might think. It's about balance, about returning the world to a state of purity. But I find it curious that an angel would concern herself with human suffering. You angels aren't supposed to linger here, not unless you've been exiled. Haziel's expression faltered for a moment, her wings drooping slightly as Amaryllis's words cut deeper than she cared to admit. She looked down, the icy vines still holding her in place, and took a steadying breath. I made a vow, I renounced violence and chose to live in peace, among the humans. I thought I could do more good that way. Amaryllis laughed. How noble! And yet, look where that vow has brought you. Had you not renounced violence and isolated yourself in that monastery, perhaps you could have prevented this winter, stopped me dead in my tracks. Haziel's eyes snapped back up. So you're just here to gloat after killing the people I care about? Amaryllis shook her head slowly, her smile fading as she met Haziel's gaze with a more serious expression. No. While gloating has been entertaining, that's not the only reason I'm here. I came to seek perspective. You see, I don't often get to speak with angels, especially those who have chosen a path so different from what is expected. I'm curious about your choices, your reasons. Haziel stared at her, the woman before her a paradox of power and curiosity. She didn't know whether to be furious or to pity this being who wielded such devastation yet sought understanding from her, of all people. Perspective? You freeze the entire continent and then come to me for perspective. Amaryllis sighed, the sound almost human in its weariness, despite the cold detachment in her eyes. I can reverse the damage I've done to the monastery. In fact, I can bring those humans you care for so deeply back to life, but only if you answer my questions. How can I trust your word? What assurance do I have that you'll keep your promise? Trust is a luxury you don't have, Angel, but understand this, I am the only one capable of undoing the damage, of saving those people you care about. You may not trust me, but you have no other choice. Haziel looked down at the icy vines still holding her in place, the cold biting into her flesh. She thought of Father Donovan, of the children and nuns, their lives frozen in a cruel parody of life, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Reluctantly, she nodded. Fine, I'll answer your questions. But if you're lying... Amaryllis waved a hand dismissively. I have no need to lie. Now, tell me, what do you think of humans? Of this world they inhabit? Haziel blinked, the question catching her off guard. She had expected something more direct, more tied to the devastation around them. Humans are complex. They're capable of great kindness, but also great cruelty. They're fragile, yet resilient. They're constantly struggling, trying to make sense of a world that often seems indifferent to them. Amaryllis listened intently, her silvery eyes locked onto Haziel's, absorbing every word. And what about this world? Do you think it was meant for them? The world isn't kind or unkind, it simply is. Humans navigate it as best they can, just like every other creature. And yet, humans believe themselves to be its masters, don't they? They bend the earth to their will, carve out cities, and wage wars over the land just like the other mortal races. Do you think they're deserving of this world? Deserving or not, they're part of it. They have as much right to be here as any other being. And what about you, Angel? Do you truly believe they won't betray you one day? That they won't turn on you the moment it suits them? Haziel laughed, a sound that echoed through the cold, desolate landscape. It was a bitter, hollow laugh, filled with defiance. I've heard people like you talk before. You think you know everything, that you understand the nature of humans and angels alike. But I'm not here to entertain your cynical views. Amaryllis's expression remained unreadable as she slowly stood up from her icy rock. Fair enough. She approached Haziel with a deliberate, measured pace, each step sending a wave of cold dread washing over the angel. Haziel's bravado faltered as a sense of impending doom settled in her chest, heart pounding in anticipation of what was to come. When Amaryllis came closer, more icy vines erupted from the ground, wrapping around Haziel's body and pulling her wings tight against her back. The cold was unbearable, seeping into her very bones, numbing her to the core. Amaryllis reached out, hovering a hand just above Haziel's forehead. The angel's breath caught in her throat as she felt a searing cold emanating from the Dryad's fingertips, a chill that was more than just physical. For a moment, Haziel saw something in Amaryllis's eyes that she couldn't quite place, something ancient and unfathomable, a depth of experience and power that far surpassed her own. "Since you love humans so much, I won't kill you." Haziel's eyes widened as she felt Amaryllis's hand finally make contact with her forehead. A bright light began to emanate from her fingertips, a blinding, searing light. Instead, Amaryllis continued, "I'll freeze you, entomb you in ice for thousands of years, where you can remain undisturbed, locked away in the cold embrace of winter. When you are found again, if you are ever found, the humans you care so deeply for will have long forgotten you. Your sacrifice, your love, it will all be nothing more than a distant memory." Haziel's vision blurred as the light from Amaryllis's hand intensified. She felt the cold spreading through her body, solidifying around her, locking her in place. A massive pillar of ice erupted from the ground, engulfing the angel in its crystalline embrace. The cold was absolute, freezing her in an instant, her wings, her body, her very soul trapped within the icy prison. The last thing she saw was the expression on Amaryllis's face, calm, serene, and utterly devoid of mercy. Chapter 46. Weary and tired. When Haziel's eyes snapped open, the world slammed back into focus in a rush of blinding color and harsh sound. Her heart pounded furiously, syncing perfectly with the seething anger now coursing through her veins. She was no longer encased in the suffocating embrace of ice but instead found herself in the same oppressive room she had last been conscious in. Acolytes in crimson robes formed a silent circle around her, faces hidden beneath deep hoods. They stood motionless, hands clasped in front of them as if in prayer, their presence as unsettling as the stillness that hung in the air. The faint crackle of the torches was the only sound, struggling against the oppressive gloom that filled the room. Near her, Chancellor Alastair stood with a rigid posture. His dark, embroidered robes hung perfectly on his frame, each fold immaculate. But beneath that veneer of control, there was a tension in the set of his jaw, a barely perceptible tightening that spoke of something lurking beneath his calm exterior. "How do you feel, Haziel?" Chancellor Alastair asked, but edged with a cold detachment. Haziel's eyes narrowed as a tide of anger surged within her, bubbling up to the surface like a boiling cauldron ready to spill over. Her memories came flooding back, each one more vivid and damning than the last. She saw it all with crystal clarity now, the manipulation, the deceit, the way she had been used as a pawn in someone else's game. "You've been taking advantage of me all this time," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. For a brief moment, Chancellor Alastair's carefully composed mask cracked as hints of irritation passed over his visage. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, his lips curved into a small, insincere smile, and he met her gaze with a look of false concern that made her blood boil. "I don't know what you're talking about, Inquisitor. You must be disoriented from..." In the blink of an eye, Haziel shattered the bonds around her like brittle glass, splintering and falling away with a sharp crack. Her newfound strength, fueled by the white-hot rage coursing through her veins, propelled her forward faster than anyone in the room could react. Her hand shot out and clamped around Alastair's head, fingers digging into his scalp with a vice-like grip. The Chancellor's smug confidence drained from his face as a strangled cry escaped his lips. He tried to pull away, but Haziel's grip was unrelenting. With a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage, Haziel slammed his head into the floor. The sound of cracking stone mingled with the wet splatter of blood as it sprayed across the ground. Alastair's body went limp in her grasp, but she wasn't finished. She lifted him again, and brought his head crashing down once again. The sound of bone shattering echoed through the room, cutting through the horrified gasps of the acolytes who stood frozen in place. The room was filled with the coppery scent of blood, thick with tension and the remnants of Haziel's unleashed fury. She released Alastair's broken body, letting it slump to the floor in a lifeless heap. Alastair's body twitched feebly, but Haziel was far from finished. She smashed his head against the ground over and over again. When she finally released him, Alastair's head was closer to a liquid than it was a solid. The acolytes finally rushed forward, robes billowing around them like dark clouds. Behind them, a group of guards in black armor pushed through with their weapons drawn. But Haziel was far beyond reason, consumed by a primal force that left no room for restraint. She raised her hands slowly, as if savoring the power that crackled at her fingertips. Red lightning sparked to life, dancing across her fingers with raw energy. Then, in a blinding flash of light, she unleashed it. The red lightning shot out from her fingertips, arcing through the air like tendrils of pure, searing energy, twisting and writhing as it sought out its targets. The first to fall were the acolytes, who could only stand helpless in the face of her wrath. The red light burned through their robes, searing the fabric and skin beneath in an instant. The acolytes crumpled to the ground, bodies smoking and lifeless before they even had a chance to scream. The guards fared no better. Lightning tore through their armor with the ease of a hot knife slicing through butter, the metal warping and melting under the intense heat. Their eyes widened in terror as the electricity fried their nerves, excruciating pain cutting their screams short. Soon, Haziel stood in the midst of the carnage, chest heaving, and hands still crackling with the remnants of the power she had unleashed. Her heart pounded in her ears, adrenaline coursing through her veins to the point it nearly made the room spin. But she didn't wait for the dust to settle. She turned and ran, wings unfurling as she bolted out of the room. Haziel sprinted down the corridors of the inquisitorial headquarters. Distant shouts of alarm began to rise as other acolytes and guards realized what was happening. But the angel had no intention of slowing down. When she rounded a corner, a group of guards clad in black armor appeared and blocked her path. They were shocked as they saw the blood-splattered angel charging toward them, hands still crackling with the red lightning that had claimed so many lives. The lead guard barely had time to raise his sword before Haziel unleashed a bolt of energy that tore through his chest, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The other guards lunged at her, but Haziel used her wings to propel her forward as she ducked and weaved through their attacks. Her fists crackled with power, each strike sending out arcs of red lightning that turned the guards' armor into molten slag and their bodies into smoldering husks. When more guards flooded into the corridor, Haziel lashed out with her wings, the razor-sharp feathers slicing through armor and flesh alike. The guards barely had time to scream before they fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground in lifeless heaps. Haziel didn't stop to survey the carnage she left in her wake. She pressed on as she fought her way through the labyrinthine headquarters. The corridors seemed endless, but she moved with a singular purpose. I am done with this place. At one point, she burst into a grand hall with high ceilings supported by massive stone pillars. Even more armored guards awaited her there, but Haziel didn't falter. She raised her hands and unleashed a storm of red lightning. The bolts crackled and danced across the room, leaping from one guard to the next, reducing them to ash in a matter of seconds. Finally, she reached a set of massive double doors, the last barrier between her and freedom. Without hesitation, she slammed into them, her strength sending the heavy doors flying open. Cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the heat and chaos she had left behind. Haziel didn't pause. She leaped into the night and spread her wings wide as she took flight. The inquisitorial headquarters shrank below her, the dark stone structure receding into the distance as she soared higher and higher. The monastery. Haziel soared through the night sky, slicing through the air with powerful strokes that propelled her forward. The cold wind whipped against her face, stinging her skin and tugging at her hair, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine and damp earth from the world below. But none of it distracted her. Her focus remained unshaken, her mind fixed on the last place she had ever truly known peace, the monastery. The world beneath her had transformed dramatically since she had last seen it, the familiar landscapes now altered by the passage of time. Forests that had once been lush and green were now dense and dark. Even villages had sprung up where there had been none before, but none of these changes mattered to Haziel. The memory of the monastery's location was etched into her mind as if she had a map right in front of her. The angel's supernatural senses honed in on the place that had once been her sanctuary. When she drew closer, her heart began to pound with a mix of anticipation, dread, and something deeper, more painful, that she couldn't quite name. She had steeled herself for the worst, bracing for the possibility that all she might find would have been reduced to nothing. But as the monastery came into view, her breath caught in her throat. Wow! It stood there, silhouetted against the night sky, its once pristine walls now weathered and worn by the elements. The arched windows, which had once welcomed the light of dawn with open arms, were dark and empty, the stained glass long since shattered. And yet, despite the decay and the ravages of time, the monastery was still there, even if just barely. The sight of it, even in its diminished state, sent a wave of emotion crashing over Haziel, and for a moment, she simply hovered there, suspended in the air. I'm glad it's still here. Haziel's heart ached with the bittersweet pull of nostalgia, but she knew she couldn't stay suspended in the air forever. She took a deep breath and then started her descent, wings folding in slightly as she glided down toward the ruins of the monastery. The closer she got, the more the details came into focus: cracks in the stone, vines that had long reclaimed the walls, the patches of moss that clung to the once smooth surfaces. It was clear that the monastery had been abandoned for many years, left to the mercy of nature and time. But it was still there, and that was enough. When Haziel touched down on the ground, she let out a slow, measured breath. It feels good to be back. Haziel stood still for a long moment, letting the memories wash over her like a tide she couldn't hold back. The cold air wrapped around her, but she barely noticed, lost as she was in the past. The monastery had been her refuge, a place where she had once believed she could find solace and peace away from the chaos of the world. Now, standing in its ruins, she was struck by how much had changed, and how much hadn't. She moved slowly through the crumbling courtyard, carefully avoiding the loose stones and overgrown roots. Every detail of the monastery was etched in her memory, and as she walked, she could almost see it as it once was. The grand entrance, now partially collapsed, had once been a place of welcome, where she and the other sisters would greet travelers seeking shelter from the harsh winter or solace for their troubled souls. She could almost hear the soft murmur of prayers, the gentle rustle of robes as the nuns went about their duties, and the distant toll of the monastery's bell. When she continued to dig through the ruins, she uncovered more remnants of the past: a cracked wooden rosary, a rusted chalice, tarnished and dull but still holding a faint glimmer of the sacred purpose it once served, and a small, broken statue of an angel, its wings chipped. Haziel's mind drifted back to the days when the monastery was alive with the presence of those she had come to care for deeply. She remembered Father Donovan, the elderly priest who had taken her under his wing, teaching her the ways of the monastery and offering wisdom and comfort when she had needed it most. She remembered the children who had come seeking refuge, their innocent faces lighting up as they learned to read and write, their laughter echoing through the halls. She remembered the simple joy of baking bread in the monastery's kitchen, the scent of freshly baked loaves filling the air as they prepared meals for the community. Those days had been filled with a quiet contentment, a sense of purpose that Haziel had thought she would never find again. But now, standing in the ruins of that life, she felt the weight of all that she had lost. The monastery was a shell of its former self, and the people who had filled it with life were long gone, their memories preserved only in her mind. Haziel looked around the ruins one last time. The monastery had given her a glimpse of the life she wanted, and now, more than ever, she was determined to reclaim it. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape her future. She could find a way to live in peace again, to hide away from the violence and turmoil that had consumed her for so long. Her thoughts turned to Charles, the kind-hearted baker who had once welcomed her into his shop with a smile. "I've had enough. I'll ask him to see if I can work in his bakery indefinitely. With luck, I can just leave everything behind and finally be at peace." Chapter 47 Final Preparations. Sera leaned her back against the ancient bark of the spirit tree, its rough texture cool against her skin. She closed her eyes and drew a deep breath, centering herself amidst the ambient energy that pulsed through the tree like a steady heartbeat. She had been feeding the spirit tree a constant stream of tributes. But Sera still remembered how the value of new tributes had been diminished greatly since the last rank up, though she still wasn't aware how much exactly. Not only that, if I recall correctly, it will now also take more core experience to get a rank up. Sera exhaled slowly, focusing on the sensation of the tree's roots as they began to move. They burrowed into her back, threading through her being like a network of living tendrils. The cool, smooth texture of the roots contrasted with the rough bark, and Sera could feel the faint pulse of energy as they connected with her core. It was then that the notification flickered before her eyes. Core experience updated to 50,000. As Sera noted how despite the experience that had been accumulated, it was nowhere near enough to propel the dungeon from rank 5 to 6. "I'll need to increase the flow of tributes or acquire more potent ones in the future." Sera slowly pushed herself off the spirit tree, the roots reluctantly withdrew from her body, sliding out with a soft, almost reluctant hiss. She took a step forward, then cast a final glance before walking away to the forest as her back healed. Time to survey the dungeon. She paused by a cluster of moon blossoms, their pale, luminous petals glowing faintly in the low light. Sera reached out, brushing lightly against the nearest blossom, feeling the cool, silky texture of the petals. "These ones are growing nicely." Continuing her path, she approached a patch of shadow ferns, their fronds a deep, almost black shade of green. These plants were essential to the forest, their presence creating pockets of darkness where smaller creatures could hide. "These have multiplied quite a bit since my last inspection," still acceptable. But as she moved deeper into the forest, something caught her eye. A flash of bold color amidst the sea of green and shadow. Sera turned her head slightly, her gaze narrowing as she focused on the source of the anomaly. There, standing alone amidst the undergrowth, was a single amaryllis flower. Its bold crimson petals were open wide, as if basking in the filtered light that streamed through the canopy above. Sera approached the flower cautiously. The amaryllis was not native to this part of the dungeon, and she was certain she hadn't placed it here. I don't remember this flower being here. The Elder Dryad knelt beside it, reaching out to touch one of the petals. It felt soft and warm against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the cool roughness of the tree bark she had leaned against moments ago. With a gentle tug, Sera plucked the flower from the earth. The moment she did, a ripple seemed to pass through the forest. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, and she glanced around, noticing that more amaryllis flowers were now emerging from the earth. They sprouted rapidly, unfurling their brilliant petals in a cascade of red that spread out before her in a widening circle. Sera rose to her feet, her eyes following the trail of flowers as it wound through the trees, leading deeper into the forest. Interesting, I'll go investigate. Her curiosity deepened as the flowers continued to bloom with each step she took. The path of flowers led her to a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly, forming a natural hollow. In the center of this hollow, the flowers clustered together to form a dense, circular pattern. As Sera drew closer, she noticed that the flowers had arranged themselves in a perfect circle and formed a portal that shimmered at the center of this floral arrangement. Its surface undulated like liquid glass, reflecting the surrounding forest in distorted waves. Sera's wariness warred with fascination as she circled the portal, tracing the patterns woven into its surface. The magic hummed with an almost musical resonance, carefully placed to create a harmonious whole. This has to be Amaryllis's work. Or at the very least, I hope it is. The Elder Dryad took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. With one last glance at the forest, Sera stepped closer to the portal, its light intensifying as she approached. She reached out, brushing the surface of the portal, feeling the warmth and energy that radiated from it, as if the portal itself was alive, waiting for her to step through. Without further hesitation, she took the final step and jumped into the portal. The world around her dissolved in an instant, the familiar sights of the forest melting away into a kaleidoscope of light and color. Sera emerged from the portal into the familiar yet unsettling landscape of the Long Death. This time, however, the swamp was transformed. The murky waters that usually sloshed beneath her feet were now a solid sheet of ice, shimmering under a blanket of freshly fallen snow. The gnarled trees that twisted grotesquely toward the sky were frozen solid, branches heavy with layers of frost and snow. The air was thick with a biting cold that made her breath fog in front of her, yet the stench of decay that usually permeated this place was now replaced by the crisp, sharp scent of winter. Sera stepped onto the frozen surface of the swamp with her bare feet. With each step, the ice beneath her feet spread out in delicate patterns, cracking and reforming instantly, reinforcing the surface against the dark waters below. I should still be careful. As she ventured deeper into the swamp, she saw how the once animate, grotesque forms of the swamp's abominations were now frozen in mid-movement, encased in thick layers of ice. One creature stood hunched over, its elongated limbs reaching out as if to grasp something unseen. Its skin, stretched taut over a bony frame, was covered in a frosty sheen, the ice distorting its wide, unsettling grin into something even more grotesque. Another abomination lay sprawled on the ground, its antlered head twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes locked in a frozen expression of rage and pain. These creatures were now rendered powerless, preserved like twisted statues. Sera's steps echoed in the silence as she passed them, her breath visible in the cold air. Good riddance. Finally, she caught sight of a figure ahead. In the center of the swamp, where the ice was thickest, stood Amaryllis. The winter dryad. She sat calmly at a table made entirely of ice, sipping from a cup also crafted from the frozen water. Opposite her was another chair, equally ornate, seemingly waiting for Sera to take her place. Sera raised an eyebrow as she closed the distance between them, taking in the surreal scene. Tea. In this place. Amaryllis's eyes flicked to Sera with a hint of cold amusement as she set down her teacup. You would do well to focus on more pressing concerns instead. Sera sighed, a plume of mist rising in the frigid air, and reluctantly settled into the chair opposite Amaryllis. The cold seeped through her clothing, but she did her best to ignore it. Fine, but can you at least explain why the swamp looks so different this time? Amaryllis leaned back in her chair, a condescending smile tugging at her lips. In part, it's thanks to you. As you grow stronger, my influence over the Long Death also increases. Then can I at least get a thank you? Don't push your luck. Sera allowed a chuckle to escape her lips, but her expression turned serious as she regarded Amaryllis. So, can you open a portal to the Long Death at will now? The Winter Dryad, who had resumed her leisurely sip from the ice-crafted teacup, shook her head slowly. Even my abilities have limits. The portal you stepped through? I can perhaps manage such a feat once every few months at most. It requires significant preparation and energy. Then you must have something important to say if you are expending this much effort. Sera said. Amaryllis sighed, a delicate plume of mist rising from her lips. She placed the cup down before looking at Sera. In truth, I'm here to warn you. Because one of my past mistakes is coming back to haunt you. Pardon. Several millennia ago, when I was still walking the surface of the world, I encountered an exiled angel named Haziel. She was living among humans, no doubt in some vain attempt to find solace or redemption. Admittedly, in my folly, I decided to amuse myself. I killed everyone she held dear, then, instead of granting her the mercy of death, I chose to seal her away indefinitely. It was done out of sheer whimsy, for no other reason than to satisfy my own pride. Sera's lips pressed into a thin line. And now, I have to pay for your mistakes. Amaryllis didn't flinch at the accusation, her expression remaining composed, almost indifferent. Yes, it appears that way. Sera's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but she forced herself to remain calm. How is it that you even know where this angel is now? Amaryllis's gaze flicked to the frozen swamp around them briefly. I don't know where Haziel is, not exactly. But I felt her. Recently, she awakened, and the power she unleashed resonated even here. It was impossible to ignore. And if she is truly awake, it is likely she will seek vengeance against you. Please, I have done nothing against this angel. There shouldn't be a problem as long as I don't use any of your abilities in front of her. Perhaps, but I have a feeling your paths will clash regardless. And before you say anything, yes, I am aware that it sounds laughable to expend so much effort to call you here just because of a hunch, but my instincts have never lied to me before. Thank you for the warning, but I'll deal with this Haziel myself if she comes for me. Sera said. Amaryllis's eyes narrowed slightly. Do not be so quick to assume you are capable of such a feat. In your current state, you wouldn't stand a chance against the angel. Sera straightened in her chair, pride bristling at the implication. And what would you have me do, then? Cower in fear, waiting for her to strike. No, I plan on training you instead. What's the point of that? I already know how to use the powers I have. And I can't access more power until the spirit tree grows further. Training won't change that. True, and I understand your limitations, but this isn't about simply harnessing more power. It's about strategy, understanding your opponent, and knowing how to exploit her weaknesses. Sera's gaze softened slightly as she considered Amaryllis's words. Despite her initial skepticism, she knew there was truth in what the Winter Dryad was saying. With a nod, Sera accepted Amaryllis's offer. All right. Let's get started. Amaryllis's lips curved into a satisfied smile, and she stood, the icy chair beneath her dissolving into a fine mist. Follow me. Sera rose from her seat, feeling the cold seep through her clothing as she followed Amaryllis deeper into the swamp. Eventually, the Winter Dryad paused in the center of a clearing. Amaryllis extended her hand, fingers splayed. The ground beneath them responded instantly, the frozen earth cracking and shifting as tendrils of ice snaked their way upward, twisting and spiraling as it coalesced into a rough, humanoid form. Slowly, with each passing moment, the shape grew more defined, the crude block of ice giving way to smooth curves and delicate contours. The figure that emerged was tall and statuesque. Ethereal wings, crafted from the thinnest layers of ice, unfurled from the figure's back, each feather etched with intricate detail. The face, chiseled with precision, bore an otherworldly beauty, high cheekbones, a delicate jawline, and eyes that seemed to gaze into the distance with a serene expression. Amaryllis stepped back before turning to Sera. Don't worry. She won't move. This clone of Haziel is merely for demonstration. Sera studied the ice figure and noted the details, the curve of the wings, the sharpness of the jawline, the cold intensity in the eyes. There was an aura of power about the statue, even in its stillness. Quite the intimidating one. Amaryllis circled the statue. Haziel's abilities are formidable. She commands red lightning, capable of incinerating anything in its path. Her wings grant her unmatched speed and agility, and her resilience is beyond anything you've encountered. She'll likely use her power to overwhelm you, to force you into a defensive position where she can exploit your weaknesses. Sera nodded, absorbing the information. And what do you suggest? Protect your head, Amaryllis said bluntly, her tone leaving no room for argument. It's the weak point of all Elder Dryads. A single well-placed strike could end you. Sera scoffed, rolling her eyes slightly. I'm aware of that. I'm not some fledgling just learning to walk. Amaryllis's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps amusement, perhaps something more serious. I don't doubt your knowledge. But in battle, it's often the simplest truths that are the most important. Interesting advice coming from you. Sera said with a chuckle. Listen, you're not me. But, I do need you to live. Hear my words and etch them into your memory, because Haziel can definitely end your life should you two clash. Chapter 48 Suspicion. Abila, capital of Lizaria. After snooping around, Haziel managed to get her hands on a brown hooded cloak which helped her stand out a lot less. The bustling streets of the capital were filled with the lively chatter of merchants and townsfolk, a stark contrast to the silence of the monastery. But regardless, there was only one place where she wanted to be. Time to check that bakery. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air as she approached the familiar wooden door. Haziel hesitated for a moment, hovering a hand just above the door before she finally knocked. The sound echoed softly in the quiet street, and she heard a muffled voice from within, followed by the clatter of something being set down. The door creaked open, and Charles stood in surprise as he took in the sight of her. Haziel? I didn't think I'd see you again. What happened to you? Haziel pulled back her hood, revealing her tired face. I've been away for a while. But I'm back now, and I need a place to lay low. Was hoping I could stay here, maybe work in the bakery to earn my keep. Charles rubbed the back of his neck as he considered her request. You're always welcome here, Haziel, you know that. But if you're running from something, or someone, especially the Inquisition, the capital might not be the safest place for you. But I can't keep running forever. I need somewhere to start over, somewhere I can just be. You know I'd help you in any way I can, but staying here could put you in more danger. Haziel's shoulders slumped, but she managed a small, grateful smile. I understand. I just didn't know where else to go. Charles's expression softened, and he reached out to clasp her shoulder. You could try Marwood. My sister Joanne runs a dessert stall there, and she's always looking for help. It's a town not too far from the capital, you could lay low for a while and get back on your feet. Are you sure your sister will just take me in? If you tell her I sent you, she'll take you in without a second thought. Joanne has a soft spot for those in need, and if you're willing to work, she'll appreciate the help. Plus, it's a bit of a different pace from the capital. Might be just what you need. Haziel nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Thank you, for everything. Charles shook his head, letting out a smile tinged with sadness. Just promise me you'll be careful, I'd hate to see anything happen to you. I'll be fine. Haziel said with a weak chuckle. Charles stepped back to allow her room to leave. Marwood's a day's journey on foot. You'll find my sister's stall near the town square, she sells these candied fruits wrapped in thin, golden brown dough. Marwood, front gates. Marwood's front gates loomed in the distance, their wooden beams sturdy and weathered from years of standing guard. The sun was still low in the sky as the line of people waiting to enter the town stretched far ahead. Haziel stood near the back of the queue, cloak pulled tightly around her to ward off the early morning chill. The line moved slowly, and Haziel took the time to observe those around her. There were refugees seeking shelter, merchants hoping to sell their wares, and a surprising number of well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place among the more typical travelers. I wonder what has drawn these wealthier people to a town like Marwood? Lost in her thoughts, Haziel barely noticed the gentle bump against her back until she heard a small voice behind her. Sorry, ma'am, a young boy said timidly as he looked up at her with wide eyes. Haziel turned to see a family of 4, a mother, father, and 2 children. The boy who had spoken couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with brown hair and a nervous expression. His younger sister clung to their mother's hand, eyes darting around the crowd. Haziel offered the boy a reassuring smile. It's fine, no harm done. The mother smiled gratefully at Haziel, though there was a tightness to her expression that caught Haziel's attention. "Thank you for understanding, he's just a bit skittish." Haziel studied the family for a moment, noticing how the parents seemed unusually tense. The father's eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, hand resting protectively on the hilt of a small dagger at his belt. The mother's grip on her daughter's hand was white-knuckled, and she kept glancing back at the line, as if expecting someone to appear behind them at any moment. "Are you headed to Marwood as well?" Haziel asked, keeping her tone light but curious. The father nodded quickly. "Yes, we are. Just passing through, really. Thought it might be a good place to rest for a while." The mother's gaze met Haziel's, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps? "We've been traveling for quite some time. The children need a safe place to stay, and we heard Marwood is peaceful." Haziel raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story. "It is a quiet town, from what I've heard. A good place to catch your breath." The mother nodded, but her eyes were distant. The father, meanwhile, was shifting nervously from foot to foot. Haziel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The kids look normal for the most part, so it's just the parents who are behaving oddly. "Actually, I need a break," the mother suddenly said out loud. The father's head snapped toward her, expression softening as he reached for a waterskin hanging from his belt. "Here, drink this. It'll help." The mother took the waterskin with trembling hands and brought it to her lips. Haziel watched as she took a long drink, her shoulders gradually relaxing as she exhaled deeply. In only a few seconds, the woman's earlier anxiety seemed to melt away, replaced by an almost unnatural calmness. She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment as if savoring the relief. Haziel played it cool while she observed the mother's sudden change in demeanor. She knew water alone couldn't have such a dramatic effect, and the way the father watched his wife with a mixture of concern and relief only heightened her suspicion. Whatever was in that waterskin, it's potent, perhaps alcohol. "Feeling better?" the father asked, taking back the waterskin. The mother nodded, a contented smile on her lips. "Much better, thank you dear." Haziel looked on the waterskin for a moment longer before she returned her attention to the family. She couldn't quite place what was bothering her about the situation, but she knew there was more to this family's story than they were letting on. Haziel studied the mother's face, noting the way her eyes had softened. "Are you sure you're okay?" The mother nodded. "I'm fine, really. Just needed a moment to catch my breath." The father quickly stepped. "We've just had a long journey, that's all. The road can be hard on families, especially with little ones." Haziel could see the weariness etched into their features, but there was something more beneath the surface. Still, she decided not to press further. They must be looking for something, perhaps something in Marwood. "Safe travels," Haziel said with a small nod. "Take care of yourselves." The boy who had bumped into her earlier gave a shy smile, while his sister clung to her mother's skirt, peering up at Haziel with wide, curious eyes. Haziel offered them a gentle wave before turning back to face the front of the line, letting the family move on ahead. As the line crept forward, Haziel noticed something peculiar: very few people were being turned away at the gates. In fact, most were being waved through with little more than a cursory glance from the guards. This struck her as odd. She distinctly remembered hearing that Marwood had been denying entry to almost everyone just a few weeks ago, its gates shut tight against the influx of refugees and wanderers. I suppose much can change even in only a few weeks, but still, this appears a bit too drastic of a policy shift. When it finally came to Haziel's turn, she stepped forward, her heart beating a little faster as she approached the guards. She expected the usual questions: her business in the town, where she had come from, and perhaps even a search of her belongings. But to her surprise, the guards barely glanced at her. One of them simply nodded and gestured for her to pass. "Aren't you going to check me for anything? Ask where I'm headed?" Haziel asked. The guards exchanged amused glances before one of them chuckled, eyes raking over her with a knowing look. "We know what girls like you are up to, just keep going." Haziel raised an eyebrow, catching the meaning behind their words. She bit back a sharp retort, knowing it wouldn't do her any favors to cause a scene. Instead, she sighed and nodded, brushing past the guards and into the town. Once inside Marwood proper, Haziel followed the directions Charles had given her, winding through the crowded market square. The bustling energy was almost overwhelming after the quiet of her journey, but she kept her head down, focused on her destination. She passed by stalls laden with colorful fruits and vegetables, baskets of herbs, and racks of smoked meats. But finally, she spotted the dessert stall Charles had mentioned. It was a modest setup, and behind the stall stood a woman who could only be Joanne. Haziel approached the dessert stall, slowing as she took in the inviting display of candied fruits and pastries, each one wrapped in a delicate layer of golden brown dough. Behind the stall, Joanne worked with practiced ease, folding thin strips of dough around plump, candied fruits. Her silver hair gleamed in the late morning sun, and her blue eyes sparkled with curiosity as she noticed Haziel approaching. "Good morning, dear," Joanne greeted. "What can I do for you today?" Haziel offered a tentative smile in return, feeling some of her earlier tension begin to melt away. "Good morning. My name is Haziel. Charles sent me, he said you might be able to help me find some work." "Ah, Charles. That rascal always knows when to send someone my way. I'm Joanne, and any friend of Charles is welcome here." "Thank you, but I don't want to be a burden. I'm willing to help out in any way I can. If you can teach me what to make, I'll do my best to be useful." Joanne chuckled softly. "Well, I was just about to start my break in about 10 minutes, but if you're that eager to get started, I'm more than happy to show you the ropes. How about we start with something simple?" Haziel nodded eagerly. "That sounds perfect." Joanne motioned for Haziel to join her behind the stall, where the small workspace was organized with a practiced efficiency. She reached into a basket and pulled out a selection of ripe fruits, setting them on the wooden counter. "Let's start with my signature candied fruit wrapped in thin, golden brown dough. It's a favorite here in Marwood, especially among the children." Haziel watched closely as Joanne demonstrated the process. She selected a plump peach from the basket and set it down in front of Haziel. "First, we start with the fruit. Peaches are a crowd pleaser, but you can use just about any fruit that holds up well to heat. We peel and slice the fruit first, like this." With practiced movements, Joanne peeled the peach's skin away, revealing the soft, juicy flesh beneath. She handed Haziel a small paring knife, and Haziel carefully mimicked the motion, the blade gliding smoothly under Joanne's guidance. Once the peaches were peeled and sliced, Joanne set them aside and moved on to the next step. "Now, for the candied part," Joanne continued, reaching for a pot of sugar and a small vial of spices. "We'll make a simple syrup to coat the fruit. Just a bit of sugar, water, and these spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a touch of clove." While Joanne measured out the ingredients, Haziel took mental notes, committing each step to memory. "Very interesting. Once the syrup's ready, we dip the fruit in and let it soak up all that sweetness," Joanne explained, demonstrating as she submerged the peach slices into the bubbling liquid. The fruit glistened as it emerged, coated in a thin, glossy layer of syrup. Next, Joanne moved on to the dough, which she had already prepared and rolled out into thin sheets. "This dough is the key to making these treats special," she said while cutting the dough into strips. "It's a simple pastry dough, but the trick is in rolling it thin and baking it just right so that it turns golden and crisp without burning." Haziel watched as Joanne wrapped each piece of candied fruit in a strip of dough, sealing the edges with a quick pinch. The rolls were then placed onto a baking tray, ready for the oven. Joanne handed Haziel a piece of dough and a slice of candied peach, encouraging her to try her hand at it. With careful hands, Haziel followed Joanne's lead, wrapping the dough around the fruit until it was snugly enclosed. Her movements were slower, less practiced than Joanne's, but the older woman's encouraging smile kept her from feeling self-conscious. "Not bad at all for your first try," Joanne said as Haziel placed her roll on the tray. "Now, we'll pop these into the oven and let them bake until they're a beautiful golden brown." The tray went into the small oven, and Haziel found herself feeling a sense of satisfaction as they waited for the treats to bake. There was something soothing about the simple, repetitive motions of baking, something that made the world outside the stall feel a little less daunting. "I wouldn't mind doing this for a good while." Joanne leaned against the counter with a knowing look. "You've got a good hand for this, I can see why Charles sent you my way." Haziel felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. "Thank you, I." Her words trailed off as something caught her eye, a man stumbling through the market, his gait unsteady. His clothes were disheveled, hair matted, and his eyes glazed over as he swayed from side to side. Something is definitely wrong with him. Joanne straightened, her cheerful demeanor faltering as she squinted at the man. "Is that Frederick?" she murmured to herself. Haziel glanced at Joanne, then back at the man. "Should I help him?" Joanne nodded quickly. "Yes, please. He's a good man, but something's not right. Immediately, Haziel moved toward the staggering figure, weaving through the crowd until she reached him. She gently grasped his arm, steadying him as he nearly toppled over. Easy there, she said softly, guiding him to a nearby wall where he could sit. Frederick mumbled something incoherent, eyes unfocused as Haziel helped him lower himself to the ground. His breath reeked of something far stronger than alcohol, and a faint, sickly sweet odor clung to him, making the angel's nose wrinkle. Joanne hurried over, her face edged with worry as she crouched beside him. She examined Frederick closely, her brow furrowed. Frederick, what's happened to you? Haziel looked up at Joanne. You know him? Yes, I usually give him some bread when I see him around. He's had some hard times, but I've never seen him like this. Do you have any idea what could have happened to him? Joanne let out a heavy sigh, briefly looking toward the bustling market as if she were checking to see if anyone was listening. There's been talk around town, about the Black Eagles. They've started selling these new potions, nasty stuff that are too strong for many people. More and more people have grown dependent on them. The Black Eagles? Haziel asked. Joanne's eyes darted around, voice dropping to a whisper. They're not something we should be discussing out here in the open. It's not safe. Let's get Frederick to a safer place first. We can talk more after. Haziel nodded, sensing the gravity of the situation. She slipped an arm under Frederick's shoulder, helping him to his feet with Joanne's assistance. They moved quickly and quietly, steering him away from the crowded market and down a narrow alley that led to the back of Joanne's stall. Once they were out of sight, Joanne led them to a small, shaded alcove behind the stall where a few crates and barrels were stacked. It was a quiet spot, hidden from the main thoroughfare, and it seemed safe enough for the moment. They settled Frederick onto one of the crates, his head lolling to the side as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Joanne knelt beside him, checking his pulse and gently brushing his hair back from his face. Poor guy, he's completely out of it. Haziel watched, her mind racing with questions. Joanne, who are the Black Eagles? And what exactly are these potions? Joanne glanced up and paused for a moment before speaking. The Black Eagles are a gang. They've been around for a while, but they've recently expanded their operations, pushing these potions that are much more potent than what I've seen before. Haziel's jaw tightened as she processed Joanne's words. Where can I find them? Joanne's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. No, no, no. That's a bad idea. The Black Eagles are not to be messed with. They'll kill you, or worse. Haziel paused, her thoughts turning inward as memories surfaced. She had once lived a life of peace, trying to shield herself and those she loved from the world's cruelties by hiding away in the monastery. Her mind replayed the scene from that fateful day when the monastery turned to ice. She could swear that she could still hear the voices of the people from back then. I have to take action. Taking a deep breath, Haziel met Joanne's concerned gaze. I can't stand by and do nothing. I've seen what happens when people turn a blind eye. If you can't tell me where they are, I'll find them myself. Joanne's face paled. Haziel, you don't understand. These aren't just street thugs. The Black Eagles are organized, dangerous, and ruthless. I've seen what they do to people who cross them. I don't want that to happen to you. I appreciate your concern, Joanne, but I have to do this. If I don't, more people will suffer. Frederick is just one of many, and I can't ignore this. Not anymore. Joanne sighed heavily, rubbing her temples as if trying to ward off a headache. You're stubborn, I'll give you that, she muttered. Fine. If you're set on this, I'll tell you what I know. But promise me you'll be careful. Haziel nodded. I promise. Joanne glanced around, ensuring no one was eavesdropping, before lowering her voice. The Black Eagles have a presence in the underground arena in the slums. You can ask around there, but be discreet. Thank you. I'll be careful, and I'll find a way to stop them. Just, come back safe, all right? Haziel managed a small smile. I'll do my best. Chapter 49 Peace No More. Black Eagle's hideout, underground arena. Zoha's boots pressed firmly against the floor, the rhythmic click echoing softly through the wide corridors of the underground hideout. Soon, she made her way to the newly created command room which was created under Mistress Sera's direction. The chamber was busy, with red-hooded figures moving with practiced urgency. The central table was littered with maps, charts, and scrolls, all smeared with the grime of countless hands. While Zoha was walking, a young man greeted her. He glanced up from the weathered parchment he was studying, fingers stained with ink and dirt. "Madam Zoha, just got the latest word from the recruiters. Numbers are up. Even got some keen ones from the capital making their way in." Zoha inclined her head as she stepped closer to the central table. Her long fingers traced the paths marked on the maps, the glow of the arcane runes reflecting off her polished nails. "And what of their loyalty?" "No worries there, madam," another operative chimed in. He adjusted his hood, the red fabric casting shadows over his scarred face. "We made it real clear what happens if they try to run." "Good, and what about preparations for the next phase?" Zoha asked out loud. "Almost set, we've secured the supplies, and the lads are ready to move. Just waitin' on your say-so." "Good, stay vigilant. We cannot afford any mistakes." The Black Eagle members nodded before returning to their tasks with renewed intensity. Zoha lingered for a moment longer, looking over the maps and plans before her. And soon, the soft rustle of parchment, the faint clink of glass vials, and the steady hum of conversation filled the chamber like a familiar melody. "Doesn't look like there's anything out of order." But then, a distant, muffled explosion reverberated through the walls. The sound was barely more than a vibration in the air, yet it carried a weight that stilled every movement. The hum of activity died instantly, as if the breath of the room had been sucked out. What was that? Zoha's eyes narrowed into sharp slits, senses sharpening as she tilted her head slightly to listen with an intensity that set her skin tingling. The explosion hadn't been close enough to cause immediate damage, but the tremor it sent out was unmistakable. That explosion came from deeper in the underground, not too far from here though. Before she could form the words to issue an order, the doors at the far end of the room were flung open with extreme force. The sound of metal crashing against stone echoed sharply, filling the sudden silence like a death knell. A Black Eagle member stumbled through the doorway, half collapsing against the frame before he pushed himself forward. His face was now exposed, streaked with blood, the red of his cloak torn and singed as if he had walked through a furnace. Smoke clung to him, curling in tendrils around his limbs as he swayed on unsteady feet. "Madam Zoha, there's a..." Before he could say anything else, a blinding flash of red lightning split the air, the brilliance of it searing into the chamber with an unnatural ferocity. The energy struck the man with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, his body convulsing violently as the arcane power coursed through him. He collapsed to the floor in a twisted heap, the smoke from his remains curling upwards, mingling with the stench of burnt flesh that quickly filled the chamber. Zoha had to take a step back as she tried to fathom what had just happened. While the gang members scrambled for cover, Zoha stood frozen for a moment longer. "I sense a presence, someone strong is nearby." Zoha's form coalesced from the swarm of flies, her cloak settling around her shoulders as she stood in a vast corridor supported by several large metallic pillars. She took in the scene quickly, looking from one fallen Black Eagle to the next, each one felled by the same brutal efficiency. The woman responsible stood in the center of the destruction. Her blue hair shimmered like a veil of icy water, while her red eyes glowed with an unwavering intensity. Red lightning arced from her fingertips, cutting down the last of the unfortunate souls who had tried to challenge her. Zoha recognized her immediately, Inquisitor Haziel. There were no unnecessary cruelties, only the cold calculation of a woman that transcended humanity. Reaching beneath her cloak, Zoha's fingers curled around the hilt of her dagger. With a swift, silent motion, she dissolved into a cloud of flies, the swarm surging forward in a dark wave that rippled through the air, reappearing behind Haziel in an instant. Zoha moved to strike, aiming to drive her blade into the Inquisitor's spine, but the Inquisitor spun with inhuman speed, hands snapping back. Red lightning exploded from her fingertips, and the demoness barely had time to register the attack before the searing energy slammed into her. The force hurled her backward with terrifying velocity, smashing through a metal pillar with a deafening crash. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Zoha gasped, pain lancing through her ribs as she struggled to rise. Through the ringing in her ears, Zoha heard the measured steps of Haziel approaching. There was no hurry in the Inquisitor's stride, no trace of arrogance or malice. She moved like a predator that knew its prey was already caught. "Arrogant bitch!" Zoha pushed herself up, one hand pressed against the cold stone floor for support. Haziel's figure loomed closer, her red eyes devoid of emotion as she regarded Zoha with the same indifference she might show to a broken tool. "I always suspected you were demon scum." And you shouldn't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, Zoha growled. Haziel's expression did not change. There was no anger, no amusement, only a chilling detachment. I'll do as I please. Zoha braced herself, tensing as Haziel's words lingered in the air like a chilling wind. The Inquisitor moved without hesitation, the red lightning in her hand snapping into the shape of a long, crackling sword. Then, Haziel lunged forward. Zoha barely had time to react, her instincts taking over as she dissolved into a swarm of flies. The sword cut through the space she had occupied a split second before, the crackle of energy singing through the air. The demoness reformed behind one of the towering metal pillars, breathing sharp and quick. There was no room for error, no chance to catch her breath. I have to keep moving, can't let her get to me. Haziel advanced, red eyes locked onto Zoha as she slashed her lightning blade through the pillar. The metal groaned under the force of the attack, tearing apart as the blade cleaved through it effortlessly. Zoha flitted to the side, shifting into flies once more to avoid the deadly strike. She reappeared a few feet away, dagger clenched tightly in her hand as she tried to find an opening, but Haziel gave her none. The Inquisitor was already upon her, the sword slicing through the air with unerring accuracy. Zoha ducked and weaved, using the pillars as cover, but Haziel's attacks were relentless. Each swing of the sword sent sparks flying as it struck stone and metal alike. Zoha retaliated when she could, sending her swarm of flies to distract Haziel. But the Inquisitor's lightning was too fast. She swatted the insects away with bursts of red energy, her movements never faltering as she pressed her attack. In one moment, Zoha slashed with her dagger and aimed for Haziel's side, but the blade met only empty air as the Inquisitor sidestepped the strike with ease. Haziel pivoted, her sword flashing in a deadly arc. Zoha twisted her body to avoid the blow, but the tip of the blade caught her shoulder, the searing heat of the lightning burning through her cloak and into her exoskeleton. Immediately, she ducked behind another pillar, breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to assess her situation. Haziel is much faster and stronger than me. I'll have to play this smart. The corridor seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in as Haziel drove her back with every swing of her sword. Zoha's back hit one of the pillars, and she knew she was running out of room to maneuver. But before she could act, Haziel's sword flashed again, the blade slamming into the pillar just inches from Zoha's head. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the stone, cracks spider-webbing out from the point of contact. Zoha's eyes widened as the pillar began to crumble, the heavy metal and stone toppling toward her. She shifted into her swarm form just in time, the flies dispersing into the air as the pillar crashed to the ground. Zoha reappeared on the other side of the corridor, her body shaking with the effort of maintaining her form. She barely had a moment to catch her breath before Haziel was on her again, the Inquisitor's sword crackling with red lightning as she slashed at Zoha again and again. Zoha ducked and rolled, dagger flashing as she tried to strike back, but Haziel was too fast. The Inquisitor parried every attack, her movements fluid and controlled, never giving Zoha an inch. Then, with a final, devastating swing, Haziel struck. The red lightning exploded from her sword, slamming into Zoha's chest with the force of a battering ram. Zoha's body was hurled through the air, crashing through yet another pillar with a bone-jarring impact. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs as she skidded to a stop against the cold floor. Haziel walked forward with the same measured steps. I expected more from a demon. Zoha lay on the ground, pain radiating through every fiber of her being. But she refused to stay down. Gritting her teeth, she pushed herself up and forced her body to obey. Purple blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but she wiped it away with the back of her hand. I was just getting started. Zoha straightened, her body protesting every movement, but the defiance in her eyes never wavered. She reached into the folds of her cloak and drew out a sewing needle, its length gleaming faintly in the dim light of the corridor. Haziel's gaze was fixed on Zoha, unblinking. The air around the Inquisitor thrummed with barely restrained power, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. Slowly, she lifted her hand, the skin of her palm tingled as arcs of red lightning crackled at her fingertips, flickering and dancing like a serpent poised to strike. Zoha responded with a measured calm that was almost unsettling. She took a slow step forward while her fingers curled loosely around the slender needle she held, the cool metal pressing lightly against her palm. It seemed so small, so insignificant in the face of the power crackling between them, yet the demoness wielded it with the confidence of someone who knew its deadly potential. The Inquisitor's expression remained cold as she flicked her wrist. Red lightning shot forth, surging with blinding speed. The corridor lit up with a harsh, crimson light, the heat from the lightning singeing the very air around it. But in the instant before the lightning struck, Zoha's body dissolved into a swirling cloud of black flies. The transformation was instantaneous, the insects dispersing in all directions with a frenzied buzz. Haziel's lightning bolt shot through the space where Zoha had stood, the energy slamming into the ground with a sizzling crack. The stone beneath it blackened and cracked, tendrils of smoke curling up from the point of impact. For a moment, everything fell almost completely silent. Haziel stood perfectly still, muscles coiled and ready to strike again. Her sword remained poised, the blade humming with residual energy. Then, without warning, Haziel's hand jerked to the side. Her movements were always precise, controlled, but this time there was a split second of hesitation, an almost imperceptible falter. A sharp, stinging pain shot through her finger. The Inquisitor's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her otherwise stoic facade. She glanced down at her hand, and what she saw made her breath catch, a clean, bloodied stump where her finger had been. Zoha reappeared behind one of the towering metal pillars, the needle in her hand now trailing a thin, almost invisible thread that shimmered in the faint light. The thread was taut, leading back to where Haziel's severed finger lay on the ground. Zoha pulled the thread with a flick of her wrist. The needle moved like a dancer in her hand, weaving through the air with a grace that belied its lethal intent. Haziel's eyes flicked up just in time to see the thread flash past her, slicing through the air with lethal precision. She twisted her body, narrowly avoiding the razor-sharp line as it whipped by, the force of it so intense that it whistled through the air, slicing clean through one of the towering metal pillars behind her. The pillar groaned as it started to collapse. The Inquisitor's eyes widened slightly as she realized what was happening, her cold composure cracking ever so slightly as the massive structure tilted and fell. Zoha's lips curled into a smile, a dark satisfaction glinting in her eyes. She had never intended to strike Haziel directly, the pillar was her target all along. She watched as the colossal metal structure teetered, then crashed down with a deafening roar, the ground trembling under the force of the impact. Dust and debris filled the air, the corridor shaking as the pillar slammed into the stone floor, trapping Haziel beneath its immense weight. A clean hit. For a moment, silence reigned. Dust swirled in the air, obscuring everything in a thick, suffocating cloud. Zoha stood still, her needle poised, her eyes fixed on the wreckage where Haziel had been. She's still alive. Then, with a blinding flash of red lightning, the pillar exploded. Chunks of metal and stone were sent flying in every direction, the force of the blast knocking Zoha back. She shielded her face with her arm as the debris rained down around her. When the dust finally began to settle, Haziel emerged from the wreckage, her form illuminated by the crackling arcs of red lightning that danced around her. She was battered, but she was very much intact. Without hesitation, she dashed toward Zoha once again. The demoness reacted instantly, as she flicked the needle through the air. The almost invisible threads she controlled sprang to life, spreading out like a spider's web, weaving through the corridor. The threads caught Haziel mid-air, ensnaring her in a deadly embrace before she could reach. Haziel's momentum halted abruptly, her body jerking to a stop as the threads tightened around her. She struggled, the red lightning that surrounded her flaring with intensity as she tried to break free, but the threads were too many, too strong. They dug into her skin, slicing through her clothes, binding her like a fly caught in a web. The more she struggled, the tighter the threads became, pulling her limbs taut, suspending her in the air. Zoha's eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction as she watched the Inquisitor struggle. With a flick of her wrist, she conjured more needles that quickly materialized in her grasp. Then, she hurled them at Haziel, the needles embedding themselves into the Inquisitor's neck with sickening precision. The threads that connected to the needles pulled tighter, forcing Haziel's head back as the sharp tips dug into her flesh. The Inquisitor gasped as pain radiated through her body. But her eyes remained fixed on Zoha, the fury within them intensifying, growing into something dangerous. The red lightning that crackled around her began to build, the arcs growing thicker, more violent, until they were almost blinding in their brilliance. The air around her hummed with energy, the pressure building as the power within her threatened to explode outward. Zoha could feel the change, the shift in the air as Haziel's power grew. The threads that held her began to vibrate, the force of the lightning straining against them, pushing them to their limits. The demoness' smile faltered slightly as she realized that Haziel was on the verge of breaking free. Oh shit! Chapter 50 Perfect Timing. Haziel's red lightning surged, slicing through the air with a force that reverberated through the entire chamber. The threads binding her vibrated with the strain, stretched to their limits as the Inquisitor's power expanded beyond what they could contain. Zoha's eyes widened, her confidence faltering as the threads threatened to snap. With an explosive burst of energy, the threads shattered. The air filled with the sound of tearing silk as Haziel broke free, the remnants of the threads whipping around her before disintegrating into nothingness. The Inquisitor's eyes blazed with fury as she glared at Zoha, her expression hard and unforgiving. Without hesitation, she raised her crackling sword, the red lightning condensing into a deadly, pulsating blade. The searing blade cut through the air with terrifying speed, aimed directly at Zoha's heart. Instinctively, she tried to shift into her swarm form, but she knew it wouldn't be fast enough. The blade was inches from her chest, the heat of the lightning already searing her skin, when suddenly, a brilliant light erupted between them. A soft glow seeped from the folds of Zoha's cloak, the faint light growing brighter until a card, radiant and spinning like a miniature sun, shot out. It sliced through the air with precision, tracing a golden arc before positioning itself between her and the descending blade. The card pulsed, edges shimmering with an ethereal, golden hue that flared as it intercepted the strike. Haziel's sword clashed against the card, but instead of biting through it, the blade halted, as though caught by an unseen hand. The light from the card intensified, a blinding brilliance that filled the space, forcing Haziel to stumble back, her vision overwhelmed by the sudden flash. Zoha blinked rapidly, her vision struggling against the lingering afterimage burned into her eyes. The world slowly came back into focus, revealing a figure standing before her, tall and confident, exuding an aura that danced between mischief and danger. Dante. The familiarity of his presence grounded her, even as the after-effects of the blinding light lingered. Zoha muttered, more to herself than to anyone else, so that's what that card does. Dante turned slightly, the playful smirk on his lips unmistakable. The fool has many tricks up its sleeve. But in this case, it only teleports me to whoever holds it when they're in deep trouble. Seems I arrived just in time. Zoha rolled her eyes, though she felt the tight coil of tension within her ease slightly at the sight of her brother. You could have warned me about the light. Dante shrugged, his smirk widening into a grin. Where's the fun in that? Besides, you looked like you could use a little surprise. Before Zoha could form a retort, Haziel shook her head, blinking away the remnants of the intense light. Her eyes locked onto the two of them, the fury within them burning just as hot as before. The air around her crackled with latent energy, red lightning sparking along the length of her sword as she prepared to strike again. Dante's expression turned serious as he exchanged a glance with Zoha. Without a word, they both dispersed and moved in opposite directions. Haziel's eyes darted between them, sword raised as she assessed her targets. But before she could choose, Dante acted first. With a flick of his wrist, Dante hurled a handful of red-colored cards at Haziel. The cards flew through the air before they exploded upon contact, each one bursting into a violent explosion of crimson energy. Haziel was forced to step back, raising her sword to deflect the blasts, but the sheer number of cards overwhelmed her defenses. The explosions rocked the chamber, sending shockwaves through the air. Seizing the opportunity, Zoha conjured her threads once more and weaved them through the air. Each one shimmered faintly as they moved to ensnare Haziel, cutting off her avenues of escape. Haziel's attention snapped to the threads, her eyes narrowing as she realized the trap being set around her. With a swift, decisive motion, Haziel spun on her heel, her sword slicing through the air. The red lightning flared as the blade cut through the threads, severing them before they could fully entangle her. But in that split second of distraction, Dante had already moved again, his cards whirling through the air toward her. Haziel twisted her body, dodging the first few cards with ease, but the relentless barrage forced her back. She lunged forward, attempting to close the distance between herself and Dante, but as she moved, more threads appeared, summoned by Zoha's quick, precise gestures. The threads snaked through the air, forming a web that Haziel had no choice but to evade or cut down. The chamber echoed with the sounds of combat, the crackle of energy, the hiss of slicing threads, and the roar of explosions. But even as the two siblings worked in tandem, it was clear that Haziel's power was overwhelming. With a final, furious roar, Haziel unleashed a shockwave of red lightning that radiated outward from her body. The force of the blast was immense, sending Dante and Zoha hurtling backward. Zoha crashed into a nearby wall, the impact jarring her bones and leaving her breathless. Dante was thrown across the chamber, skidding to a stop as he slammed into the cold stone floor. The shockwave dissipated, leaving the chamber in eerie silence, broken only by the sound of rubble settling and the faint crackle of residual lightning. Haziel stood in the center of the destruction, her red eyes glowing with an intensity that promised there would be no mercy. Zoha pushed herself up from the rubble, her body aching from the impact, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. She wiped a streak of purple blood from her forehead, gaze locking onto Haziel, who still stood mostly unfazed, red lightning crackling around her form like a halo of destruction. Dante rose beside her, brushing the dust from his coat with a wry grin. Seems like she's not going to go down that easy. Zoha smirked, her lips curling into a feral grin. Then let's just hit her harder. Without another word, the two siblings launched themselves at Haziel. Dante moved like a shadow, his cards appearing in his hands as if by magic, each one glowing with the promise of devastation. He threw them with deadly precision, aiming to pin Haziel down and create an opening that Zoha could exploit. Haziel deflected the cards mid-air, each explosion rippling through the chamber with enough force to shake the very foundation. But for every card she deflected, another two took its place, closing in from every angle. Zoha dissolved into her swarm form. The black cloud of flies buzzed through the air, circling Haziel, obscuring her vision, biting at her skin. Soon, the demoness reformed behind Haziel, dagger gleaming as she struck out and aimed for a vital spot. But the Inquisitor spun with unnatural speed, lightning-imbued sword slicing through the air. Zoha barely managed to twist out of the way, the blade missing her by a hair's breadth, the heat of the lightning scorching her side. She retaliated with a quick slash of her own, but Haziel parried it effortlessly, the force of the block sending Zoha stumbling backward. Meanwhile, Dante continued his assault, summoning more red cards charged with explosive energy. He flanked Haziel, trying to draw her attention away from Zoha, to give his sister the chance she needed. But Haziel still managed to bat away his attacks with ease. Zoha lunged again with her dagger, but Haziel met her head-on. The Inquisitor's sword clashed against Zoha's blade, the red lightning arcing between them as they struggled for dominance. The demoness gritted her teeth, pouring all her strength into the attack, but Haziel's power was overwhelming. With a savage twist, the Inquisitor broke the deadlock and swung her sword down with brutal force. The blade caught Zoha across the chest, the red lightning searing through her defenses. Zoha gasped in pain, the force of the blow sending her reeling. Dante hurled more cards, trying to divert Haziel's attention, but the Inquisitor was relentless. She blocked his attacks with ease, focus never wavering from Zoha. The demoness knew she was being cornered, but she refused to back down. She shifted into her swarm form again, the cloud of flies scattering in all directions, but Haziel anticipated the move. With a snap of her fingers, the Inquisitor unleashed a pulse of red lightning that radiated outward, energy crackling through the air like a living thing. The swarm of flies was caught in the blast, the arcane energy tearing through them with merciless precision. Zoha reformed a few feet away, trembling from the strain. Haziel was already upon her, with her sword raised high. Zoha tried to dodge, to shift into her swarm form again, but she was too slow. The Inquisitor's sword descended with unerring accuracy, the blade piercing through Zoha's defenses and driving deep into her stomach. Zoha's eyes widened in shock, a choked gasp escaping her lips as the pain lanced through her body. The red lightning flared, searing her flesh, the smell of burning skin filling the air. Haziel twisted the blade with a cold and detached expression as she watched Zoha's life force drain away. But before Haziel could twist the blade further and end it, a flash of bright yellow light exploded in front of her eyes. The light was so intense that it seared her vision, blinding her momentarily. Haziel hissed in frustration, instinctively pulling her sword free from Zoha's body as she staggered back, hands flying to her eyes to shield them from the painful glare. Dante's heart pounded in his chest as he seized the fleeting moment of opportunity. He moved with fluid urgency as he darted to Zoha's side. Her body was limp, skin more pallid than usual, and breath shallow. When he reached her, she barely stirred, her eyes flickering open just enough to recognize him through the haze of agony that clouded her senses. Her lips parted, a faint attempt at speech, but the words failed her. All she could manage was a weak, almost imperceptible nod, her last bit of strength yielding to her brother's care. Dante wrapped one arm around her waist, feeling the dead weight of her body slump against him. His muscles strained as he supported her, his grip firm yet gentle. With his free hand, he reached into the depths of his coat, fingers brushing against the familiar texture of the red cards he had stashed there. "Hang on," Dante whispered. He glanced over his shoulder, his gaze narrowing as he caught sight of Haziel. She was already regaining her bearings, the blinding light's effects rapidly fading from her red, fury-filled eyes. Her sword was raised, the air around her crackling with barely contained power. Immediately, Dante flicked his wrist and hurled the red cards behind him. The cards sliced through the air, spinning before embedding themselves into the ground. A split second later, the chamber was rocked by a series of violent explosions. The force of the blasts sent shockwaves rippling outward. The stone pillars that lined the corridor groaned under the strain, spiderweb-like cracks spreading across their surfaces. Haziel, still disoriented by the blinding light, was caught off guard by the sudden onslaught. She barely had time to raise her sword in a defensive stance before the explosions tore through the chamber. The bases of the pillars crumbled, unable to withstand the force of the detonations, and the heavy stone structures began to topple inward. The chamber was filled with a deafening roar as the pillars collapsed, one after the other, in a devastating domino effect. Dust and debris were hurled into the air, creating a thick, suffocating cloud that obscured everything in its path. Haziel tried to dodge the falling stone, but the sheer volume of debris overwhelmed her. The weight of the stone bore down on her, pinning her in place, as the remnants of the once ground chamber caved in around her.